My name is Alice Montgomery, and I was 32 the day I learned exactly what greed looks like when it thinks nobody is watching. I had spent the entire morning driving 6 hours down the highway from my small apartment in Tallahassee to Lake Butler just to celebrate my grandmother Vivian's 82nd birthday. I had her favorite lemon pound cake sitting in a bakery box buckled onto my passenger seat. I expected to find her on the back veranda reading a hardcover mystery novel with a glass of iced tea. Instead, I found a heavy steel realtor lockbox clamped to her cast-iron front gate. My stepmother Beatrice had not just listed the $3.6 million estate behind my back. She had already hosted an open house, served catered champagne on the lawn, my grandfather seated by hand, and told a pair of real estate developers that she was the sole executor of the property. My stepbrother Bryce was banking on this exact cash sale to cover a multi-million-dollar commercial loan default. They thought because I lived 300 miles away, working as a county probate archivist, I was out of the loop. They assumed Vivian was too old and too medicated in the temporary wellness facility they had locked her inside to put up a fight. They assumed they had won. I did not scream when I saw the lockbox. I did not break a window or confront them with tears. I simply reached into my bag and touched the wax-sealed manila folder my grandmother had given me 11 months earlier. What happened 3 days later at the title company closing table cost my stepbrother his entire company and left my father with nothing but a rented condo and a broken marriage. Welcome back to Elderly Stories, where dignity always gets the final word. Before I tell you how a single springing conservation clause destroyed their entire plan, drop your age in the comments and subscribe. Now let me take you back to that Tuesday afternoon and the empty veranda that started it all. The drive down Interstate 75 is usually a straight shot of pine trees and faded billboards, but that Tuesday felt different. The October air hung heavy and thick outside my windows. I spend 40 hours a week inside a windowless records annex, deciphering the messy, complicated legacies people leave behind when they pass away. You learn very quickly that property changes people. It twists them into unrecognizable versions of themselves. Siblings fight over timber rights, and children sue over silver cutlery. But Vivian Montgomery was the constant, steady force in my life. Her mid-century house on the shoreline of Lake Butler was my true north. It was the exact place I learned to swim, and the only place I never had to apologize for being quiet. I pulled my aging Honda onto the shoulder of the private drive at 2 in the afternoon. The wrought iron gate stood closed. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Vivian always left them open when she knew I was visiting. I walked up to the bars and saw the silver master lock, a combination box meant for real estate agents. My pulse gave a dull, measured thud against my ribs. I did not panic. When you archive legal disasters for a living, you learn to collect the facts first. I slipped through the side pedestrian gate, using a trick with the latch I learned when I was 10. The crushed gravel crunched loud under my shoes. The sprawling front porch came into view, and my stomach dropped. The ceramic frogs were gone. The wicker rocking chairs were missing. The potted ferns Vivian tended every single morning had vanished. I unlocked the heavy oak front door with my spare key. The air inside hit me like a physical blow. It smelled like synthetic vanilla and bleach, the distinct chemical odor of a professional staging company. Vivian had Persian rugs that traced back to her own mother. Those were gone, replaced by woven Cecil mats. The framed photographs of my high school graduation and my grandfather in his Navy uniform had been stripped from the drywall. Only bare eggshell paint stared back at me. I carried the bakery box into the kitchen and set it on the pristine quartz island. The coffee maker was missing. The tea tins were hidden. Next to the sink sat a neat stack of glossy cardstock. I picked the top one up. It was a trifold brochure. Exclusive lakefront estate off-market cash sale. The date printed at the bottom was Sunday, 2 days ago. Beatrice had walked strangers through these halls while I was indexing court files in Tallahassee. I pulled out my phone and dialed my father. Richard Montgomery answered on the 4th ring. His voice carried a hollow echo, like he was standing in a tiled hospital corridor. "Alice," he said. His tone was cautious. "You are not at the lake house, are you?" "Where is Grandma?" I asked. My tone stayed flat. "If you show emotion to my father, he uses it to dismiss you as hysterical." "She is resting." Richard sighed. The sound grated with practiced weariness, the kind of sigh a parent uses on a difficult teenager. "Beatrice and I found a wonderful wellness facility in Orlando for her. Her memory is slipping, Alice. We had to make a tough call for her own safety." "What is the address?" I asked. "It is a secure facility, Alice. They do not allow unannounced visitors. She needs quiet right now. We are managing her transition, and we will bring you into the loop when she settles down." "Did she pack her own bags?" I asked. "Do not do this," Richard said. "Do not make this harder than it already is. Your stepmother has been working around the clock to ensure your grandmother is comfortable." He hung up before I could ask another question. I stood in the sterile kitchen listening to the silence of a stolen house. I walked toward the back patio doors leading to the garden. Just outside the threshold, partially kicked under a modern staging chair, lay a single canvas gardening glove. The fabric was stained with dark potting soil. Vivian never went anywhere without checking her azaleas. She did not leave her tools out to rot. She had not packed a bag and driven to Orlando willingly. A throat cleared behind me. I spun around to find a man in a golf shirt, standing near the edge of the property line. Mr. Henderson, the neighbor who had lived next door since I was a toddler, stood near the hedges. He held a pair of rusty clippers and offered a warm, oblivious smile. "Alice, I thought that was your car," he said. "I just wanted to say congratulations. Beatrice mentioned you guys secured a cash buyer over the weekend. Friday closing, right? Taking a lot of stress off your plate, I imagine. Maintaining a place this size is too much for Richard and Beatrice anyway." I looked at him. The afternoon sun beat down on the back of my neck. Then I looked at the glossy paper in my hand. Friday. It was Tuesday afternoon. I had exactly 72 hours to figure out how my stepmother was selling an estate she did not own, and where she had hidden the woman who did. The facts arranged themselves in my head like the files in my annex. Beatrice had forced Vivian out of the house. Richard had allowed it to happen. They had hired a staging crew to erase 80 years of history over a single weekend. They had found a cash buyer willing to close in under 5 days. You do not move that fast unless you are running from a debt or trying to hide a crime before the rightful owner catches you. I thanked Mr. Henderson, offering a tight nod so he would not suspect anything was wrong. I walked back to my car, leaving the lemon pound cake abandoned on the pristine quartz island. I turned the key in the ignition and typed the names of every high-end rehabilitation center in the Orlando area into my phone. Beatrice always viewed my job as a dead-end hobby. She liked to joke at Thanksgiving dinners that I was just a glorified librarian dusting off old papers. She did not understand that working in probate law teaches you how to dismantle a fraud piece by piece. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the gates. The first step was finding my grandmother. The second step was making sure my stepmother never saw a single dime of that $3.6 million. Finding the facility took me less than an hour of sitting in a strip mall parking lot, scrolling through public directories on my phone. I did not need a private investigator to track them down. I just needed to understand my stepmother. Beatrice married my father a decade ago, bringing along her college-age son Bryce, and a fierce desire to ascend the local social ladder. She operated on appearances and aesthetic value above all else. If she was going to lock my grandmother away, she would choose a place with an elegant name and a lobby that looked like a boutique resort. I searched for luxury memory care centers within a 40-mile radius. The third result was a compound called the Grand Monarch Pavilion. It boasted private wellness suites and concierge medical care. It was the exact type of glossy, high-walled prison Beatrice would select so she could brag to her tennis club friends about providing top-tier accommodations for her ailing mother-in-law. I merged onto the highway and drove south. The Grand Monarch Pavilion sat behind a row of manicured palm trees and an automated security gate. I parked near the visitor entrance, letting the heavy Florida humidity wrap around me as I stepped out of the car. The lobby smelled of piped-in lavender, hiding the underlying sterile scent of clinical sanitation. A receptionist sat behind a marble desk, typing on a dual monitor setup. I did not stop to ask for permission or directions. In my line of work, if you ask for access, you invite people to deny it. I walked past the front desk with a brisk, purposeful stride, staring down at my phone like a consulting specialist running late for an appointment. The receptionist did not even look up from her keyboard. I navigated the thick carpeted hallways, reading the brass nameplates mounted next to heavy wooden doors. The architecture was designed to feel like a cruise ship interior, but the dark domes of security cameras tucked into every ceiling corner and the keypad locks on the stairwell doors told the true story. This building was constructed to keep people inside. I found room 214 at the far end of the east wing. The door was cracked open a fraction of an inch. I pushed it wide and stepped across the threshold. Vivian sat in a vinyl medical recliner positioned near a sealed window overlooking a concrete parking deck. The flat-screen television mounted on the wall played a daytime cooking show on mute. My grandmother was wearing a hospital-grade cotton gown instead of her usual pressed linen blouses. Her silver hair lacked its familiar careful styling, hanging flat and lifeless against her cheekbones. Her chin rested on her chest, and for a terrifying second I thought they had sedated her into total oblivion. Then I stepped closer, and her eyes snapped open. They were not foggy or confused. They were sharp and bright, carrying the familiar creekwater clarity I had known my entire life. "Alice," she breathed. Her voice was raspy, dry from disuse and lack of water. I knelt beside her chair and gently took her hands. The skin on her knuckles was papery thin and covered in dark purple mottling. Fresh needle marks dotted the crook of her left arm. They had been giving her intravenous fluids, or perhaps something stronger to keep her lethargic and compliant. A heavy knot formed at the base of my throat. This was the woman who taught me how to prune rose bushes and read complex property deeds on the back porch. Seeing her reduced to a patient in a sterile, supervised room sent a cold shiver down my spine. "I am here, Grandma," I whispered, keeping my voice low. "I am getting you out of this place." She gripped my wrist. Her fingers trembled, but the physical pressure was intentional and firm. "They took my keys, Alice." She looked toward the closed closet door across the room. "They took my purse and my phone." Richard stood right there in the hallway and let her take my things. The betrayal in her voice was a physical weight dropping into the room. My father had stood by and watched his second wife strip his own mother of her independence. Before I could ask Vivian what day they brought her here, the heavy wooden door swung open behind me. "Well, this is quite the surprise." Beatrice stood in the doorway holding a beige leather handbag that cost more than my first sedan. Her blonde hair was sprayed into a flawless helmet holding back any hint of the outdoor weather. She wore her signature socialite warmth like a tailored theater costume. Behind her stood Bryce. He was 30 years old, wearing a fitted sport coat over a designer dark shirt. Bryce carried himself with the unearned smugness of a man who always had someone else clean up his financial messes. He ran a commercial real estate venture that was little more than a vanity project funded by my father and whatever equity Beatrice could scrape together from joint accounts. Beatrice stepped into the room and offered a sad, sympathetic smile that failed to reach her eyes. "Alice, sweetheart, we did not expect you to drive all this way. Your father told you we were keeping visitors to a minimum right now. Vivian is having a very difficult week. The dementia is advancing so rapidly. The doctors say she needs round-the-clock supervision." I stood up, placing myself directly between Beatrice and the vinyl recliner. "Vivian is not suffering from advanced dementia," I said. My voice remained at the volume of a normal, calm conversation. "She needs her reading glasses in her own bed." Beatrice sighed, placing a manicured hand over her heart. "Oh, Alice, denial is a normal part of the grieving process for family members. We are simply doing what is best for everyone involved. The lake house is a massive liability now. The property taxes and maintenance are draining her accounts." "So you staged it behind my back?" I asked. "You put a lockbox on the front gate and scheduled a fast cash closing for Friday to pay for her care." The fake sympathy vanished from Beatrice's face, leaving behind a tight, calculating glare. She glanced over her shoulder at Bryce. Bryce let out a short, mocking laugh and stepped forward. He crossed his arms, looking down at me with a lazy sneer. "Look who decided to play internet detective," Bryce said. "The county clerk thinks she understands adult financial decisions." "Listen carefully, Alice. The lake house is getting sold. The funds will be managed properly by people who actually understand how capital markets work. You do not get a vote in this transition." "You do not own the house, Bryce," I told him, keeping my gaze locked on his. "And neither does your mother. You cannot legally close a real estate transaction on a property that does not belong to you." Bryce smiled. It was a cold, triumphant expression. He reached into the inner pocket of his sport coat and pulled out a folded piece of heavy stock paper. He flicked it open and held it up just out of my physical reach. "Medical and financial power of attorney," he said, tapping the bottom signature line with his index finger. "Executed last Thursday, signed by Vivian Montgomery, witnessed and notarized. My mother is the designated agent. We have total legal authority to liquidate assets to provide necessary medical care. You are nothing but an estranged granddaughter with zero legal standing." I looked at the document. Even from 2 feet away, I could see the signature on the bottom line. It was a shaky, fractured mess of blue ink. It did not look anything like the confident cursive Vivian used to sign her holiday cards. They had cornered her last week. They had likely waited until she was disoriented from the painkillers given for her bruised arm and shoved a pen into her hand. It was textbook coercion masked as familial concern. "You forced her to sign that paper while she was under medical duress," I stated. "No reputable title company will accept a power of attorney signed under those conditions if they know the clinical context." "Prove it," Bryce challenged, leaning in closer. His cologne smelled like cedar wood and expensive gin. "Prove it before Friday morning." "Oh wait, you cannot do that, because you do not have any access to her medical records. We locked those down yesterday afternoon." Beatrice checked her gold wristwatch. "This visit is over, Alice. You are upsetting your grandmother. I am the primary contact on her medical file, and I am instructing the nursing staff to remove you. If you refuse to leave the room right now, I will have the front desk security escort you out for trespassing." I looked back down at Vivian. She was watching the exchange with silent intensity. I knew that arguing in a hospital room would accomplish nothing except giving Beatrice the satisfaction of calling the police and causing a public scene. A probate archivist knows that you never fight a paper war with your mouth. You fight it with superior paperwork. "I will leave," I said. I turned back to the vinyl recliner and leaned down to hug my grandmother goodbye. She smelled like institutional soap and old lavender sachets. As I wrapped my arms around her frail shoulders, I felt her right hand slide down my back. Her fingers brushed the edge of my blazer pocket. Something small and hard dropped into the fabric lining. "Do not let them take the azaleas," Vivian whispered directly into my ear. Her voice was barely a breath against my hair. "I will not," I promised her. I stood up and walked past Beatrice and Bryce without looking at either of them. The hallway stretched out before me, quiet and gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. I walked through the lobby and out the sliding glass doors into the sweltering Florida heat. The heavy glass shut behind me, locking with a definitive electronic click. Beatrice had officially barred me from the building. I was legally cut off from the only family member who mattered to me. I reached my car and unlocked the door. Once I was sitting in the driver's seat hidden behind the tinted windows, I reached into my blazer pocket. My fingers closed around the object Vivian had slipped to me. I pulled it out and held it up to the steering wheel to inspect it. It was a small brass key. The top was stamped with a 4-digit number and the faded logo of a regional bank located in downtown Lake Butler. A safety deposit key. Beatrice and Bryce thought they held all the winning cards because they had a coerced signature on a fresh document. They thought a Friday closing was a guaranteed victory line. But they did not know my grandmother the way I did. Vivian Montgomery did not trust easily, and she never left her legacy unguarded. I looked at the brass key catching the afternoon sunlight through the windshield. The next layer of the mystery was waiting for me inside a bank vault, and I had just enough time to find it before the sun went down. The brass key rested heavy inside my palm as I left the Sterile Rehabilitation Center and walked back to my car. First Regional of Lake Butler sat on Main Street. It was an old brick building that still handed out cherry lollipops at the teller windows and treated ledgers with reverence. I checked my dashboard clock. 3:45. Small-town financial institutions always lock their doors right at 4. I threw my car into gear and merged onto the northbound interstate. I pushed the speedometer past the legal limit. The Friday deadline hovered over me like a guillotine, dropping closer with every passing minute. Bryce and Beatrice were relying on a coerced medical directive, but my grandmother had handed me a physical countermeasure. I just needed to reach it before the vault timed out for the day. In my line of work, the person who holds the oldest, most comprehensive document usually wins. A fresh piece of paper signed under duress is a blunt instrument. A well-structured estate plan is an impenetrable fortress. Vivian built a fortress. I just had to get inside it. I pulled into the asphalt lot at 3:54. The afternoon heat radiated off the pavement in shimmering waves, distorting the view of the street. I pushed through the heavy glass doors into the air-conditioned lobby. The space smelled of lemon polish and ancient paper. I walked straight to the vault manager. She was a woman in her late 60s, wearing a floral blouse and a silver name tag that read Martha. Martha recognized me immediately. Vivian had been bringing me to this lobby since I was tall enough to reach the high counter. Martha smiled, but her eyes held a quiet concern. She said it was good to see me and noted they had not seen Vivian in weeks. She mentioned hearing Richard moved her into an assisted care facility. I kept my expression neutral. I told Martha my grandmother was transitioning and I needed to access her box. I reminded her I was a registered co-signer on the account. Martha nodded and typed my name into her terminal. She verified my driver license and led me down a short carpeted hallway into the steel-walled room. The walls were lined with hundreds of narrow metal doors glowing under harsh fluorescent lights. The room temperature dropped 10 degrees in here to preserve the paper documents. Martha inserted her master key into box 412. I slid the brass key into the second slot. We turned them in unison. The locking mechanism clicked, echoing loudly in the silent, secure room. Martha pulled the long metal drawer out. She set it on a private viewing table in the corner and left me alone to review the contents. I stared at the closed metal lid. Most affluent families use these boxes to store heirloom jewelry, rare coin collections, or bearer bonds. But Vivian Montgomery did not care about diamonds. She cared about legacy and protection. I lifted the lid. The box was empty except for a single thick manila folder. It was sealed shut with a flap of red wax. I ran my fingers over the paper. The heft of it was unmistakable. As a probate archivist, I handle thousands of legal files every single year. I know what a comprehensive estate plan feels like. This was the ultimate paperwork weapon. I broke the wax seal. A stack of crisp legal documents slid onto the table. The paper was a heavy stock cotton blend that crinkled with a satisfying sound. The first page carried a bold, centered heading: the Vivian Montgomery Revocable Living Trust. I scanned the execution dates at the bottom of the page. She signed this instrument 11 months ago. Long before the memory lapses started, and long before Beatrice found a luxury cage in Orlando. While entirely lucid, my grandmother had legally transferred the lakefront property out of her personal name and placed it directly into the protective shell of this trust. I flipped to the successor trustee designation. My name sat printed in clear dark ink. Alice Montgomery, sole successor trustee. I felt a sudden rush of vindication. By transferring the estate into a trust, Vivian ensured that no individual holding a generic directive could sell the property. The house belonged to the entity, not the woman. Bryce and his mother were trying to sell an asset they had zero legal authority to touch. Clipped to the back of the trust instrument was a secondary document printed on medical letterhead. It was a physician affidavit from her longtime neurologist. The paragraphs were clinical and precise. The doctor confirmed Vivian demonstrated full testamentary capacity on the exact day she signed the trust. She understood her assets, she knew her family, she acted with clear intent. It was an ironclad defense against any future claims of dementia or cognitive decline. I leafed through the remaining pages. Tucked between the witness signatures and the embossed notary stamp was a smaller piece of paper. It was a sheet of heavy cream stationery, the kind Vivian used for thank you cards. The cursive handwriting was steady and deliberate, carrying the distinct looping letters I recognized from my childhood. Alice, when Beatrice gets greedy, read the last page. Love, Grandma. I read the short sentence 3 times. A lump formed in my throat. She knew. 11 months ago, she saw the trajectory of her son and his new wife. She anticipated their betrayal and quietly laid a trap. My chest swelled with a fierce, protective pride. My grandmother was not a helpless victim sitting in a vinyl chair. She was a master tactician who had outsmarted them all. I reached for the final page of the trust document, eager to see what weapon she had buried in the fine print. But my archivist instincts interrupted me. A trust is only as strong as the public record supporting it. If Beatrice and Bryce were reckless enough to schedule a Friday closing with a cash buyer, they had to have convinced a title company the deed was clear. You cannot close a sale on a property locked inside a trust using a basic directive unless you lie to the escrow officer. I pulled out my phone. The vault had terrible cell reception, but I managed to connect to the bank guest network. I navigated to the county clerk official portal. The interface is outdated and requires exact parcel numbers, but I navigate it blindly every day for work. My fingers moved quickly, typing the identification number for the Lake Butler estate into the search bar. The digital ledger populated on my screen, showing the history of the property deed. The trust transfer from 11 months ago was recorded perfectly, but right above it, sitting at the very top of the ledger, was a new filing. The date stamp read yesterday morning. It was an affidavit of trust dissolution. I zoomed in on the document image. The text claimed that Vivian Montgomery had formally dissolved her living trust and reverted the property back into her personal name. The signature at the bottom was the same shaky, coerced scrawl I had seen on the paperwork in the rehabilitation center. The filer listed on the county record was Bryce. My blood ran cold. They were not just bending the rules, they were actively committing title fraud. A title company will perform a search before closing looking for encumbrances. By filing this fake dissolution, Bryce effectively blinded the title company. The search would show the property reverted to Vivian individually. Then Beatrice steps in with her forced signature to authorize the sale. Bryce had walked into the county courthouse and filed a perjured affidavit to clear the chain of title. He was gambling that nobody would contest the dissolution before the cash buyer wired the funds on Friday morning. Once the money hit their accounts, they would likely transfer it offshore or bury it in corporate shell companies, making it nearly impossible to recover. The sheer arrogance of the crime was staggering. Bryce thought he was smarter than the system. He thought because he wore expensive suits and drove luxury cars, the law would look the other way. In Florida, filing a fraudulent deed instrument is a felony. Bryce was risking prison time to cover his debts. He was that desperate. My father Richard had to know. You do not dissolve a family trust and list a $3 million estate without the patriarch noticing. Richard was complicit. He was watching his wife and stepson dismantle his mother and her legacy. He was choosing to look the other way. The realization tasted like copper in my mouth. I had spent my entire life trying to earn Richard and his approval, playing the quiet, dutiful daughter, while Beatrice paraded Bryce around like the golden child. I was done seeking validation from a man who would trade his own mother for peace and quiet. I stacked the documents back together. I did not read the final page yet. I needed to secure the physical evidence first. I slid the trust instrument, the medical affidavit, and the handwritten note back into the manila folder. I left the bank vault carrying the file against my chest like body armor. I walked out into the late afternoon sun. The heat felt suffocating after the chill of the steel room. I unlocked my Honda and tossed the folder onto the passenger seat right next to the forgotten bakery box. I needed a plan. I needed to confront my father. I reached for the ignition, but my phone buzzed in my hand. The screen illuminated with a text message from an unsaved number with an Orlando area code. I tapped the notification. Alice, this is Greg with Suncoast Realty. Beatrice gave me your number. We are finalizing the walkthrough for the buyers. Please ensure all your personal belongings are cleared out of the guest house by Thursday evening. The new owners want to start demolition on the garden Friday afternoon. Let me know if you need a junk removal contact. I stared at the glowing text. Demolition on the garden. They were going to tear up Vivian and her azaleas the moment the ink dried. They were erasing her existence. I had lived in that guest house during my final year of college. It held my books, my records, my old acoustic guitar. Beatrice did not care about my possessions. She just viewed them as trash blocking her payday. Thursday evening. That gave me exactly 48 hours to detonate their entire scheme. I gripped the steering wheel and put the car in drive. It was time to dig into public records and find out exactly why Bryce was in such a lethal hurry. I needed a quiet place to work where nobody could track my internet protocol address. I drove to a nearby municipal library sitting on the edge of the county line and found an isolated table in the back corner. I connected my laptop to the public network and opened the state corporate registry portal. My daily routine involves tracking down hidden assets for deceased estates, so I know exactly where people bury their financial mistakes. If Bryce was willing to commit title fraud on a $3 million property, he was hiding a catastrophic liability. My stepbrother always projected the flawless image of a self-made mogul. He wore custom-tailored suits and drove a leased German sports car, but I always suspected his commercial development firm was built on shifting sand. I ran a search query using his holding company identification number. The results populated instantly across my screen. The digital ledger showed a long list of active litigation dockets. I clicked on the most recent civil filing originating from a major commercial lender based in Miami. The plaintiff was demanding immediate repayment of a defaulted construction loan. The principal amount listed in the complaint was $2.5 million. I downloaded the attached exhibits and scanned the signature pages. Bryce had leveraged his entire real estate portfolio on a failed strip mall project located in Osceola County. But he did not secure the debt alone. Right below his printed name on the guarantor line was Beatrice Montgomery. They were drowning in debt. The commercial bank was threatening to seize everything they owned, including Beatrice and her personal assets. They were not liquidating the lake house to provide memory care for an elderly woman. They were stealing Vivian and her legacy to save themselves from total financial ruin. If they missed the deadline to cure the loan default, the lender would force them into involuntary bankruptcy. That explained the Friday cash closing. They needed liquid capital before the courts froze their bank accounts next week. I closed the court documents and opened a new browser tab. I navigated to Beatrice and her social media profile. My stepmother curated her online presence with surgical precision. Her feed was an endless parade of country club luncheons, charity galas, and designer shopping trips. I clicked on her most recent upload. The photo showed her sitting on a velvet patio chair, holding a crystal flute filled with a sparkling orange beverage. She wore oversized designer sunglasses and a perfectly pressed linen sundress. The caption below the image read, "Making hard family choices today, but feeling blessed for the support of my loving husband and son." A stylized heart emoji sat at the end of the sentence. The hypocrisy formed a physical weight inside my chest. She was drinking champagne, while my grandmother sat heavily medicated in a sterile vinyl recliner. Beatrice viewed Vivian as nothing more than a disposable resource, an automated teller machine she could crack open to maintain her country club membership. The quiet sorrow inside me hardened into something cold and sharp. I packed up my laptop and walked out of the library. Greg, the real estate agent, said the buyers wanted to start demolition on the garden today. I had to stop them. The drive back to the estate felt like a blur of gray asphalt and green pines. I turned onto the private dirt road and heard the grinding roar of heavy diesel engines before the house even came into view. I stomped on the accelerator pedal. My Honda vaulted over the gravel driveway, kicking up a thick cloud of white dust. I slammed the brakes and threw the transmission into park. A yellow bulldozer sat idling on the back lawn. Its metal treads were already tearing deep gashes into the pristine manicured grass my grandfather had spent decades cultivating. Two contractors wearing neon safety vests stood near the property line, unrolling orange plastic fencing. The steel bucket of the machine was raised, hovering directly over the long row of vibrant pink azaleas Vivian loved more than anything else in the world. The new buyers were not waiting for the ink to dry on Friday. They wanted their infinity pool dug out right now, and Bryce was letting them do it to ensure the cash wired on time. I jumped out of my vehicle and ran across the yard. "Stop!" I yelled, waving my arms toward the operator sitting inside the glass cab. "Turn the machine off right now." The driver frowned and pulled a mechanical lever. The diesel engine idled down to a low rumble. He slid the window open and looked down at me. "I am the legal trustee of this estate," I said, keeping my voice loud enough to carry over the engine noise but steady enough to project authority. "You are trespassing on a protected trust property. If that bucket touches a single flower, I will file an injunction and name your excavation company in a civil lawsuit." The driver blinked and reached for a two-way radio clipped to his dashboard. Before he could press the transmit button, a familiar voice interrupted us from the patio. "Ignore her." I turned around. Bryce walked down the back steps holding a metal clipboard and wearing expensive leather loafers that had no business being on a construction site. He marched across the torn grass, stopping a few feet away from me. He did not look panicked by my sudden appearance. He looked deeply annoyed. "Get back to work," Bryce yelled up to the operator. "We have municipal permits and the new owners want this perimeter cleared by sunset." I stepped directly in front of the metal treads, placing my body between the heavy machinery and the garden. "You do not own this land, Bryce," I told him. My tone matched the cold steel of the bulldozer blade. "You filed a perjured dissolution affidavit yesterday morning. That constitutes a felony offense. The title company is going to see the discrepancy and the buyers will pull their funds. You are looking at a prison sentence." Bryce let out a harsh laugh. It was a cruel, ugly sound echoing across the serene lake water. He tapped the clipboard against his thigh. "You really think a small-town clerk is going to catch a paperwork error before Friday morning?" he asked. "You are delusional, Alice. My mother holds the medical power of attorney. We possess the legal right to manage her assets. The buyers are a corporate development group. They do not care about your little garden. They care about closing the deal and getting their luxury pool built." I stood my ground, refusing to break eye contact. "The irrevocable trust supersedes your coerced document," I stated. Bryce closed the physical distance between us. His smug expression vanished, replaced by a dark, threatening glare. He leaned down, bringing his face inches from mine. "You listen to me very carefully," he hissed. "You think you hold the winning cards because you have some old paperwork hidden away in a vault. But you are forgetting something crucial. We control her physical care. We dictate where she sleeps, what she eats, and who she sees. My mother has full access to Vivian and her remaining liquid cash accounts. The checking, the savings, the retirement distributions. Everything." He paused, letting the threat hang suspended in the humid afternoon air. "If you cause a scene at the title office on Friday, I will drain every single penny from those accounts before the weekend is over." Bryce continued, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I will empty her life savings to pay my legal fees, and I will move Vivian to a state-run facility so fast, your head will spin." A Medicaid bed in a concrete building, Alice. Imagine your precious grandmother sitting in a crowded public ward because you wanted to play hero over a house. You back down right now, or I promise you I will make her final years a living nightmare. The blood rushed in my ears. He was holding Vivian hostage. The real estate was just the beginning. The conflict had mutated from a property dispute into a fight for her actual survival. If I played my hand too early, he would destroy her finances and hide her away in a bureaucratic nightmare. I needed an ally. I needed the one person who could stop them without triggering an immediate retaliation. I needed my father. I drove away from the lake house, leaving the heavy diesel engines grinding against the quiet afternoon. Bryce had drawn a line in the sand. He held Vivian as a physical hostage inside that Orlando facility. If I detonated the real estate deal without a surgical strategy, he would empty her bank accounts and banish her to a state-run ward. I could not fight him directly yet. I needed an ally on the inside. I needed the one person who could stop the bulldozers without triggering an immediate retaliation. I drove toward the edge of town and pulled into the gravel lot of a diner called the Silver Spoon. It was a neutral location. I dialed my father and asked him to meet me. I kept my tone flat, mentioning I had some estate documents to review. Richard arrived 25 minutes later. He stepped out of his vehicle wearing a tailored button-down shirt and pressed slacks. My father always prioritized his outward appearance. He built a long career in regional insurance sales, relying on a firm handshake and a reassuring smile. I spent my entire childhood looking up to that smile, believing it meant safety and protection. I watched him walk through the diner entrance, and I desperately wanted to believe he was merely a victim. I wanted to convince myself that Beatrice manipulated him. I needed to believe he remained oblivious to the felony his stepson was currently orchestrating. I sat across from him in a cracked vinyl booth, grasping a cold glass of ice water. Richard ordered a black coffee and smiled at the waitress, using the exact same practiced charm he deployed on his clients. He turned to me and asked how the drive from Tallahassee was. He spoke with a casual, breezy tone, as if we were meeting to discuss a holiday dinner menu. I did not engage in his small talk. I pulled my laptop from my canvas tote bag and flipped the screen open. I turned the device around so it faced him across the sticky table. I brought up the commercial court dockets I had found at the library. I showed him the $2.5 million default notice. I pointed directly to the guarantor line bearing his wife and her signature. I explained the timeline piece by piece. I laid out the truth about the off-market listing, the fake dissolution affidavit, and the Friday cash closing. I told him Bryce was committing title fraud to cover a catastrophic business failure. I explained they were liquidating the lake house to save themselves from imminent bankruptcy. I watched his face closely, waiting for the shock to register. I waited for the horror to widen his eyes. I expected him to grab his phone and halt the transaction. I expected him to act like a son protecting his vulnerable mother. Richard did not reach for his phone. He did not gasp or express outrage. He simply looked down at his ceramic coffee mug and stirred the dark liquid with a metal spoon. The utensil clinked against the rim, creating a rhythmic, hollow sound. He already knew. The realization hit me like a physical weight, dropping straight into my stomach. He knew his stepson was drowning in commercial debt. He knew his wife was legally exposed to the creditors. He had agreed to sacrifice Vivian to balance their financial ledger. Richard let out a slow, measured breath. He leaned forward and adopted a soft, paternal tone. He utilized the voice he always employed when trying to smooth over an uncomfortable truth. "Alice, you have to understand the immense pressure we are under," he murmured. "Bryce made some risky investments, but he is a good kid at heart. If this commercial loan defaults, Beatrice will lose everything she has worked for. The stress is tearing our marriage apart. Your stepmother needs a win right now." I stared at him, letting the words echo in the space between us. "She needs a win," I repeated. "You are allowing them to steal a $3 million estate from an 82-year-old woman so your wife can have a win." Richard frowned and shook his head, dismissing my concern. "You are being overly dramatic, Alice. Your grandmother is slipping away from us. She sits in that room and barely recognizes the television programs. She will not know the difference whether she is in a luxury suite in Orlando or her old bedroom at the lake. The house is just a building. We are repurposing a dormant asset to protect the family." He reached across the table, attempting to pat my hand in a gesture of fake solidarity. As his arm extended, the cuff of his tailored shirt pulled back. The overhead diner lights caught the bright reflection of a heavy metallic object strapped to his wrist. I looked down. It was a brand new luxury timepiece, a designer chronograph featuring a sapphire crystal face and a polished platinum band. I inventory wealthy estates for a living, so I recognized luxury goods immediately. That specific watch retailed for at least $12,000. It was pristine and unscratched. It was a celebratory purchase. a down payment on the upcoming Friday payday. My father had not just agreed to the theft, he was actively profiting from it. He was taking his own cut of the stolen inheritance. The paternal illusion I had clung to for 32 years shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. He was not a weak man manipulated by a cunning spouse. He was a willing participant who eagerly traded his morals for comfort and expensive status symbols. I pulled my hand away from his touch, avoiding the physical contact. I closed my laptop and slid it back into my tote bag. "What are you doing?" Richard asked. His voice tinged with genuine confusion, as if I was the one behaving unreasonably. "We need to get on the same page here, Alice. We are family." I stood up from the vinyl booth. I looked down at the man who had raised me. I did not raise my voice to cause a scene. I did not shed a single tear. The anger inside my chest burned far too cold for tears. "You are selling your mother for a watch," I stated. Richard opened his mouth to defend himself, but I did not wait to hear the pathetic excuse. I turned my back and walked out of the diner. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, stepping out into the fading afternoon sunlight. I abandoned any lingering hope of reasoning with them. I severed the family relationship right there on the pavement. I reached my Honda and unlocked the driver's side door. As I slid onto the seat, my phone buzzed inside my pocket. I pulled the device out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a new email notification. The sender was Greg, the real estate agent, forwarding an official message from the downtown Orlando title company. The subject line read, "Final closing schedule confirmation." I opened the message and read the brief text. The escrow officer had formally scheduled the cash transfer and deed signing for 10 o'clock on Friday morning. They had completely bypassed my verbal warnings at the lake house. Bryce was pushing the fraudulent paperwork through the system at lightning speed, relying on his fake dissolution affidavit. I checked the digital time on my dashboard clock. The countdown was officially locked in place. I had exactly 48 hours to build a legal trap they could never escape. I drove away from the diner with the image of my father and his $12,000 watch burned into my memory. Arguing with them was a useless endeavor. You cannot reason with people who view a family member as a financial asset waiting to be liquidated. I needed to shift tactics. I needed to stop fighting with emotion and start fighting with protocol. In the probate archives, we have a specific saying: the loudest person in the room is usually covering up a defective deed. I decided to let the records speak for me. I parked outside my cheap roadside motel room and dialed the one person who could help me navigate the incoming legal storm. Marcus Thorne was a veteran estate attorney who had mentored me during my first 3 years at the county clerk office. He possessed 4 decades of experience dismantling fraudulent wills, and he knew every dirty trick desperate heirs tried to pull. I called Marcus and laid out the entire situation over a secure telephone line. I explained the coerced medical directive, the fake dissolution affidavit, and the Friday morning deadline. Marcus listened quietly, absorbing the details without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me to review the dates on the new paperwork my stepmother had forced Vivian to sign. I pulled up my digital scans of the hospital discharge summary I had retrieved earlier that week. Vivian had suffered a minor fall in her garden 10 days ago, resulting in a badly bruised hip. The local clinic prescribed a heavy dose of narcotic painkillers to manage her discomfort. I compared the prescription timeline to the date stamped on the power of attorney Bryce paraded around the rehabilitation center. They matched perfectly. Beatrice cornered my grandmother during the exact 48-hour window when Vivian was heavily sedated and medically disoriented. The legal instrument was entirely voidable. "We have her," Marcus stated, his voice crackling slightly over the phone speaker. "A signature obtained under the influence of strong narcotics holds 0 weight in a court of law. We can file an emergency injunction to block the sale today." I felt a brief surge of hope, but Marcus quickly extinguished it. He explained the harsh reality of the judicial system. Filing an emergency petition requires a judge to review the evidence and issue a formal order. The courts in Central Florida are chronically backlogged. A hearing could take 3 weeks to schedule on the docket. If we tipped our hand now, Beatrice and Bryce would realize we were coming for them. They would proceed with the closing, transfer the cash to an offshore account, and tie us up in endless litigation while the money vanished into thin air. We did not have 3 weeks. We barely had 2 days. Marcus outlined a different approach, a high-risk, high-reward strategy that bypassed the courtroom entirely. We do not block the closing, he instructed. We let them walk right into the trap. Title officers carry immense personal liability for fraudulent transfers. If an escrow agent records a defective deed, they can lose their professional license and face severe financial penalties. No reputable title officer will authorize a transaction if they know the chain of ownership is actively disputed. Marcus told me to walk into that room on Friday morning and drop the ironclad trust documents directly onto the mahogany table. The title company will instantly halt the deal to protect themselves from civil liability. Beatrice will be trapped in a conference room with the buyers she lied to and the real estate agents she deceived. The fallout will be immediate and catastrophic. I agreed to the plan. It was dangerous, but it was the only way to sever their financial lifeline before the weekend arrived. Thursday evening descended, bringing a heavy, humid stillness to the air outside my motel window. I spent the hours engaging in the quiet, methodical process of preparation. I find a deep, settling calm in organizing paperwork. While other people pace or shout to relieve stress, I align margins and verify notary stamps. I sat at the cheap laminate desk and assembled my manila folder. I placed the original recorded deed at the front. I tucked the physician capacity evaluation behind it, ensuring the signature faced outward for maximum visual impact. I printed certified copies of the hospital discharge summaries, highlighting the narcotic dosage dates with a bright yellow marker. Each piece of paper represented a solid brick in the protective wall I was building around my grandmother. Once the file was flawless, I moved to the small closet. I pulled out my charcoal gray work suit and plugged in a travel iron. I pressed sharp creases into the slacks and smoothed the collar of my white blouse. I wanted to look like a professional archivist, arriving to execute a legal mandate, not a frantic relative staging an emotional family intervention. The repetitive motion of the hot iron gliding over fabric grounded me. The steam rose into the dim room, carrying away the lingering anxiety. It was the calm before the storm. I laid the clothes across the bed and stared at the manila folder resting on the desk. Everything was ready. Then my phone shattered the silence, breaking my concentration. The caller identification displayed the main desk number for the Grand Monarch Pavilion. I answered immediately, expecting a medical update regarding Vivian. Instead, the facility administrator spoke with a cold, detached professionalism. She informed me that my visitation privileges were officially revoked. Beatrice had contacted the front desk and enacted a strict security protocol. As the recognized medical proxy, my stepmother instructed the staff to deny me entry under any circumstances. If I stepped foot on the property, the administrator warned they would dispatch local law enforcement to arrest me for trespassing. The line went dead before I could reply. I stared at the dark screen. They had completely isolated Vivian. She was trapped in a strange room surrounded by strangers, unable to make a simple phone call or ask for help. Beatrice was tightening her grip, using the stolen authority to build a fortress around her captive. The stakes elevated from a property dispute to a rescue mission. I placed the phone down on the desk next to the assembled folder. My stepmother thought she had checkmated me by blocking my physical access. She believed cutting me off from the facility would break my resolve and send me driving back to Tallahassee in defeat. She underestimated the power of the evidence sitting in front of me. The digital clock on the nightstand clicked to 10 o'clock. I had exactly 12 hours before the Friday morning showdown. The countdown was in its final stretch. I turned off the motel lamp and lay down in the dark, listening to the hum of the window air conditioner. Tomorrow, I was going to war against my own family and my only weapon was a single manila folder. Thursday night settled over the Central Florida highway, bringing a stifling heat that crept right through the thin walls of my rented room. I sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, listening to the mechanical rattle of a window air conditioning unit. The neon sign from the parking lot cast long orange shadows across the cheap laminate floor. The psychological weight of the impending morning pressed down on my shoulders. Beatrice had successfully isolated Vivian inside that luxury rehabilitation center, leaving me entirely cut off from the only family member I truly loved. The silence in the room felt heavy. I had no way to call my grandmother. I had no way to warn her about the bulldozers currently tearing up her beloved garden. The enemy held all the physical territory, but I held the map. I opened my canvas tote bag and retrieved the manila folder. The wax residue still clung to the paper flap, a physical reminder of the unbroken chain of custody. I slid the thick stack of legal documents onto the bedspread. The desk lamp illuminated the heavy cotton blend pages. I had spent my professional life reading through thousands of similar files, indexing the quiet ways people distributed their wealth and settled their final affairs. Most folks use trusts as a simple shield to avoid the lengthy probate process. They draft standard language protecting their assets from taxes and creditors. I assumed Vivian had done the exact same thing. I assumed she simply built a defensive wall around the lake house. My fingers brushed against the small piece of cream stationery tucked near the back of the file. Alice, when Beatrice gets greedy, read the last page. Love, Grandma. I stared at her steady, looping handwriting. A vivid memory surfaced, cutting through the stale motel air. I was 19 years old, sitting on the back veranda of the Lake Butler estate. A summer thunderstorm was rolling in off the water, bringing the sharp scent of ozone and wet pine needles. Vivian sat in her favorite wicker rocking chair, holding a complex insurance policy for the property. She wore her reading glasses perched low on her nose and held a red felt pen in her right hand. She called me over and placed the dense packet in my lap. She told me to read the exclusions section. I struggled through the dense paragraphs, finding the legal phrasing confusing and intentionally dull. I complained that nobody actually reads the end of these booklets. Vivian tapped the bottom of the page with her red pen. That is exactly what they are banking on, Alice, she told me. The people who want to take your money always bury the hook at the very end. They rely on your impatience. They rely on your arrogance. Greed always misses the fine print. The memory faded, leaving me alone in the dim orange light. I picked up the trust instrument and flipped past the standard boilerplate sections. I bypassed the successor trustee designations and the standard distribution clauses. I turned to page 42, the final sheet of paper before the notarized signatures. The heading at the top of the page read, Section 8, Paragraph 4, Special Provisions. I leaned closer to the desk lamp, letting the words come into focus. The legal jargon was dense, layered with specific statutory references and property codes. But as a probate archivist, I speak that language fluently. My eyes scanned the text, translating the dense paragraphs into plain English. It was a springing conservation clause. My breath caught in my throat. I read the paragraph a second time to ensure my mind was not playing tricks on me in the late hour. The text remained unchanged. A springing clause is a unique legal mechanism. It lies dormant inside a document waiting for a very specific external event to occur. Once that predefined event happens, the clause springs into action, executing a predetermined command automatically. It requires no judge. It requires no court order. It happens the moment the trigger is pulled. I looked at the triggering event Vivian had outlined in ink 11 months ago. The clause stated clearly that if any party attempted to sell, encumber, or transfer the Lake Butler property, utilizing a secondary power of attorney without the explicit written authorization of the designated successor trustee, the safety mechanism would activate. Beatrice scheduling the cash closing for tomorrow morning using her coerced medical directive was the exact trigger. I moved to the next paragraph detailing the consequence of the activation. Vivian did not just protect the house. She weaponized the dirt itself. The document decreed that upon the unauthorized attempt to sell the deed, would instantly and irrevocably transfer ownership to the Florida Environmental Land Trust. This organization operates statewide, acquiring undeveloped land and wetlands to protect them from commercial developers. By executing this clause, Vivian was permanently donating the $3 million estate to a nonprofit conservation group. The lake house would eventually become a protected nature preserve. But Vivian was pragmatic. She included a life estate provision for herself. This meant that while the environmental group owned the actual property, Vivian retained the legal right to live inside the house for the remainder of her natural life. Nobody could evict her. Nobody could force her into a state-run ward. The sheer brilliance of the trap left me stunned. I sat back against the headboard, letting the reality wash over me. Beatrice and Bryce thought they were so clever, pushing a fast cash sale to cover a looming commercial debt. They thought filing a fake dissolution affidavit at the courthouse cleared their path to a massive payday. But they were walking blindfolded into a minefield. By sitting at that mahogany table tomorrow and presenting her forged documents, Beatrice was not just going to fail at selling the house. She was going to accidentally detonate the springing clause. She was going to trigger the permanent removal of the property from the family financial portfolio. The equity would vanish instantly. There would be no house to borrow against. There would be no asset to liquidate. Bryce would get nothing. Beatrice would get nothing. The estate would be zeroed out forever. My grandmother knew her daughter-in-law was motivated by pure, unadulterated greed. Vivian knew Beatrice would rush the process, desperate to get her hands on the money. And because she was rushing, Beatrice would never bother to request the original trust documents from the bank vault. She would never take the time to read the fine print. I ran my hand over the heavy paper, feeling a profound sense of awe. Vivian Montgomery did not need me to save her. She had saved herself 11 months ago. She just needed me to act as the messenger. I needed to carry the detonator into the room. My cell phone buzzed against the nightstand, vibrating against the cheap wood. The sudden noise broke the quiet stillness of the room. I picked up the device and looked at the glowing screen. A new text message waited in my inbox. The sender was Richard. I unlocked the screen and read the short sentence. "Please do not cause a scene tomorrow, Alice. It is done." My father was sitting in his rented condo, checking his new luxury watch, hoping his quiet, compliant daughter would stay away and let the theft happen in peace. He wanted to avoid the discomfort of a confrontation. He wanted the money to clear the bank so he could go back to pretending his life was perfect. He believed the battle was over. I looked at the text message for a long time. I thought about the bruised skin on Vivian and her hands. I thought about the yellow bulldozers tearing up the azaleas she had planted when I was just a little girl. I thought about the fake socialite smile Beatrice wore while she locked my grandmother in a sterile medical prison. I did not type out a long, emotional response. I did not hurl insults or threaten him with legal action. I kept my words concise. I wanted him to sleep tonight thinking he had won. I wanted the shock tomorrow morning to be swift and devastating. I tapped the digital keyboard, relying on 3 simple words. I will be there. I hit send and tossed the phone onto the mattress. I gathered the trust documents and slid them back into the manila envelope. I placed the folder next to my pressed charcoal suit. The eve of destruction was over. The trap was fully set. I closed my eyes and waited for the sun to rise. Friday morning arrived with a blinding glare reflecting off the Orlando skyscrapers. The digital clock on my dashboard read 9:45. I parked my aging Honda inside a subterranean concrete garage surrounded by imported luxury sedans and glossy sports cars. The elevator carried me up to the 14th floor in total silence. Capital Horizons title and escrow occupied the entire top level of the high-rise building. The setting provided a stark contrast to my grandfather and his handmade wooden porch. This place was a modern temple built for corporate transactions. The walls were constructed of seamless frosted glass panels. The polished marble floors clicked sharply under my charcoal dress shoes. The air conditioning ran at a freezing temperature, circulating a synthetic blend of expensive cologne and ozone. I carried only 2 items. A modest leather purse slung over my shoulder and the sealed manila folder gripped tightly in my right hand. The reception area featured an imposing geometric desk carved from dark slate. A young woman wearing a wireless headset sat behind a dual monitor setup. She looked up, offering a practiced corporate greeting designed to soothe wealthy clients. I did not stop walking. I told her I was joining the Montgomery closing in progress. She blinked, her hands hovering over her keyboard. She stated my name was not on the approved guest registry provided by the listing agent. She asked me to wait in the lobby while she buzzed the escrow officer for authorization. I ignored the instruction. I maintained my brisk, steady pace, navigating the labyrinth of frosted glass corridors. In probate law, hesitation is an invitation for defeat. If you wait for permission from the people trying to steal from you, you will never get inside the room. I followed the low hum of voices until I found a heavy walnut door bearing a brushed steel plaque, Conference Room A. I pushed the heavy door open without knocking. The scene inside was infuriatingly celebratory. It looked like a victory lap for a race they had rigged from the starting line. A catered breakfast spread sat on a side credenza, featuring imported French pastries and crystal carafes of fresh orange juice. Beatrice stood near the floor-to-ceiling window, wearing a designer silk blouse in a soft cream color. She held a flute of mimosa, her manicured fingers resting delicately against the thin glass. She was holding court, basking in the glow of her impending payday. Bryce stood near the head of a long mahogany table. He wore a sharp navy suit, firmly shaking hands with two men I recognized instantly as the cash buyers. The developers wore tailored charcoal jackets, projecting the slick, hungry energy of men who bought distressed properties for pennies on the dollar. They were laughing at a joke Bryce had just delivered, sealing their new partnership. My father sat near the corner of the table, separated from the joyful networking. Richard was not laughing. He did not hold a champagne flute. He stared down at his interlaced fingers, looking intensely at the polished wood grain. His posture was rigid, projecting the quiet shame of a man who knew he was committing a profound betrayal but lacked the spine to stop it. The new luxury chronograph watch glinted under the recessed ceiling lights, catching the reflection of the morning sun. He looked small, sitting in that expensive leather chair. He looked like a man waiting for a storm he knew he deserved. The moment I crossed the threshold, the atmosphere inside the room fractured. The laughter stopped abruptly, hanging suspended in the chilled air. Beatrice lowered her mimosa. The fake socialite warmth drained from her face, leaving behind a harsh, calculating snarl. Her eyes darted from my face to the manila folder in my hand. She recognized the threat immediately, even if she did not yet understand the specific mechanism of her destruction. The crisp edges of the folder signaled documentation, and documentation always ruins a fragile scam. "What are you doing here?" Beatrice snapped. Her voice lost its refined melodic tone, taking on a sharp, grating edge that echoed off the glass walls. She turned her attention to the woman seated at the far end of the mahogany table, the escrow officer. Ms. Vance was a stern, professional woman in her late 50s, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a dark, tailored blazer. She sat behind a towering stack of legal documents, her expensive fountain pen poised over a signature line. Beatrice pointed a trembling finger in my direction. "Ms. Vance, I need this woman removed from the premises immediately. She is an estranged relative. She has a history of unstable behavior, and she is attempting to disrupt a private family transaction. Call your building security right now." The two developers exchanged a wary glance. Cash buyers despise complications. They thrive on smooth, quiet transitions, devoid of legal friction. The sudden presence of an angry family member signaled a messy, contested title. One developer took a slow step back from the table, crossing his arms over his chest. Beatrice saw the hesitation and panicked. She forced a rigid smile, attempting to smooth over the escalating tension before the buyers walked away. "It is nothing to worry about, gentlemen," Beatrice told the developers, utilizing a sickly sweet tone. "Just a minor family disagreement. My stepdaughter has always struggled with her emotions during stressful transitions. We will have her escorted out, and then we can sign the final transfer papers." Bryce did not wait for building security to arrive. He relied on the same physical bullying tactics he used his entire life. He dropped his charming facade and marched around the edge of the mahogany table. He stepped directly into my personal space. He stood mere inches away, attempting to use his height and broad shoulders to intimidate me into retreating. His face flushed a dark, angry red. "You need to turn around and walk out that door right now," Bryce hissed, speaking through gritted teeth so the developers could not hear the venom in his voice. "You are embarrassing yourself, Alice. You have no power here. The medical directive is already filed. The money is sitting in escrow ready to wire. The deal is done. Get out before I call the police and press criminal harassment charges." I did not step back. I did not flinch. I let him hover over me, absorbing the stench of his expensive cedar cologne and stale coffee. I remembered the heavy yellow bulldozers idling on Vivian and her pristine lawn. I remembered the bruised purple skin on her frail hands. I kept my breathing slow and measured, regulating my nervous system. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic, chaotic energy. I simply looked past his shoulder, focusing my gaze directly on the escrow officer sitting at the head of the table. Ms. Vance was watching the confrontation with sharp, analytical eyes. She had seen countless families tear each other apart over money, but she was a professional bound by strict regulatory laws. She recognized that my calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Beatrice and her frantic shouting. Ms. Vance set her expensive fountain pen down on the polished wood. The soft click echoed loudly in the tense, silent room, cutting through the suffocating tension. She adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and folded her hands over the stack of closing documents. She ignored Beatrice and her demands for security guards. She ignored Bryce and his physical posturing. She looked directly at me, assessing the firm grip I maintained on the paperwork. "Ma'am," Miss Vance asked, her voice carrying the cool, detached authority of a judge presiding over a chaotic courtroom. "Do you have a legal standing in this transaction?" I held her gaze. I stepped around Bryce, ignoring his presence entirely. I walked to the edge of the mahogany table. I placed the wax-sealed manila folder on the polished surface. "I am the sole successor trustee of the Vivian Montgomery Revocable Living Trust," I stated. My voice remained steady, keeping the volume at the level of a casual afternoon conversation. I did not yell to command the room. I did not need to project my words over the tense atmosphere. I let the sheer legal weight of my declaration suck the remaining oxygen out of the space. Ms. Vance froze in her leather executive chair. Her hands stopped hovering over the thick stack of closing packets. She lowered her expensive fountain pen, placing it carefully on the blotter. I stepped up to the edge of the mahogany table and grabbed the flap of the manila folder. The crisp scent of old paper and sealing wax drifted across the polished wood grain. I pulled the documents out and laid them flat, executing the motion with the precise, methodical rhythm of a dealer laying down a royal flush on a casino felt. The first instrument I slid across the table was the certified copy of the recorded trust deed. The official county seal, stamped in the top right corner, caught the harsh glare of the overhead lighting. I pointed a single finger to the filing date printed along the upper margin. 11 months ago, my grandmother executed this specific transfer, placing the Lake Butler property under the exclusive, impenetrable protection of this legal entity. Ms. Vance leaned forward, her professional curiosity snapping into sharp focus. Her eyes darted across the heavy cotton paper, reading the statutory language she knew intimately from decades of escrow work. Beatrice let out a harsh scoff that sounded like tearing fabric. The carefully constructed socialite facade she maintained for the country club set collapsed entirely in a fraction of a second. She was a woman who married into old money late in her life, carrying a heavy chip on her shoulder regarding her own humble beginnings. She always felt she deserved the Montgomery fortune far more than the actual Montgomerys did. Beatrice rushed forward, her designer silk blouse wrinkling as she slammed her palm against the table. "That trust was dissolved," she shrieked, her voice pitched upward, losing all its refined melody and echoing wildly off the frosted glass walls. She reached into her oversized leather handbag and produced her own piece of paper, slapping it down violently next to my date-stamped deed. "My husband is her only son." Beatrice yelled, pointing a shaking manicured finger at Richard, who remained frozen in his chair, staring at the floor. Richard is the primary heir, and I have her legal signature granting me full medical and financial authority right here. She tapped the page so hard her acrylic nail threatened to pierce the thin printer paper. It was a desperate theatrical display. She expected the escrow officer to bow to the sheer volume of her demands, because retail managers and restaurant hosts always bent to her will when she threw a tantrum. She was attempting to bulldoze reality using pure, unearned entitlement. I did not argue with my stepmother. Engaging in a shouting match validates the opposition and grants them a false sense of equal footing. Instead, I looked directly at the escrow officer, ignoring Beatrice and her frantic energy completely. I reached back into my folder and retrieved the second piece of the puzzle. I slid Dr. Mercer and his clinical capacity evaluation across the smooth wood, positioning it right next to the original trust deed. This is a sworn affidavit from her primary neurologist, I explained, keeping my tone strictly informational like an archivist citing a historical record. It confirms Vivian demonstrated full testamentary capacity on the exact day she funded the trust. She was oriented to time, place, and person. She understood the permanent consequences of her actions. Then I pulled out the third crucial document. The hospital discharge papers. I laid them gently beside Beatrice and her brand new power of attorney. These are her medical records from last week, I continued, pointing to the yellow highlighter ink that practically glowed against the stark white page. As you can see, Vivian suffered a fall and received intravenous prescriptions for heavy narcotic painkillers during the exact 48-hour window when my stepmother obtained that signature. She was medically compromised, lethargic, and legally incapacitated when she signed your generic internet template document. Any directive signed under pharmaceutical duress is void. A sharp, fragile noise pierced the heavy silence suffocating the room. It was the sound of crystal clinking nervously against polished wood. I glanced toward the far end of the mahogany table. Bryce had lowered his catered mimosa glass, but his hand was trembling so badly it caused the heavy base to rattle against the table surface. His arrogant swagger had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow shell of a man. Bryce spent his entire adult life operating in the gray areas of commercial real estate, bullying subcontractors and smooth-talking desperate investors. He was accustomed to people backing down when he wore expensive suits and raised his voice. He had never faced an opponent who brought an airtight paper trail to a shouting match. He stared at the date-stamped hospital records, realizing his mother had just walked them straight into a documented felony in front of professional witnesses. Ms. Vance ignored the family drama unfolding around her. She focused entirely on her fiduciary duty. She picked up the power of attorney Beatrice had slapped down. She adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and scrutinized the ink at the bottom of the page. Then she picked up the 11-month-old trust deed. She placed the two signature lines side by side on the blotter. I watched her eyes flick back and forth, comparing the penmanship with the cold precision of a forensic analyst. The contrast between the two documents was undeniable. The signature from last week was a shaky, forced scrawl. The pen had lifted off the paper multiple times, leaving jagged gaps between the letters. It looked like the desperate, chaotic mark of a woman trying to escape a physical trap. The signature from 11 months ago flowed with sharp, undeniable cursive. The loops were confident, and the ink pressure was even reflecting the steady, unyielding hand of the matriarch I knew and loved. The two corporate developers stood frozen near the catered breakfast credenza, watching the legal disaster unfold in real time. Cash buyers despise friction. They operate on tight margins and require clean, unencumbered titles to execute their development plans. They recognized immediately that Beatrice had misrepresented her authority and dragged them into a fraudulent transaction. The sudden appearance of a superseding trust document meant the $3 million property was locked behind a legal wall they could not breach. The lead developer, a tall man wearing a tailored charcoal suit, set his coffee cup down. He stepped forward, his expression hardening into a mask of pure corporate fury. He did not look at the escrow officer or the forged paperwork. He narrowed his eyes directly at Beatrice and asked, "What is going on here?" The atmosphere inside conference room A thickened, turning the breathable oxygen into something dense and suffocating. Ms. Vance did not rush her examination. As a veteran escrow officer, she functioned as a historian of property lines and legal claims. She understood that a rushed judgment resulted in catastrophic civil liability. She placed her manicured finger at the top of my certified trust document, tracing the ink down to the embossed county seal. She cross-referenced the execution dates against the hospital discharge summaries, displaying Vivian and her heavy narcotic prescriptions. The silence stretched out agonizingly. The only sound was the crisp rustle of thick cotton paper and the faint hum of the building ventilation system. Beatrice watched the title officer scrutinize the overlapping timelines. She possessed a predatory instinct for social dynamics. She recognized her loud shouting had alienated the cash buyers standing near the breakfast credenza. The developers were businessmen who required clean, predictable transactions. Beatrice shifted her strategy, instantly pivoting away from raw anger and sliding right back into her practiced socialite charm. She smoothed the front of her silk blouse and offered a warm, sympathetic smile toward the two men in tailored suits. "Gentlemen, I apologize for this dramatic interruption," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Please do not let this clerical delay worry you. My stepdaughter Alice has always harbored a deep-seated bitterness regarding our family dynamic. She feels left out of the estate planning process and occasionally acts out to seek attention. We have full legal control over the property. I assure you my husband and I will resolve this minor paperwork misunderstanding shortly, and we can proceed with the wire transfer as scheduled." The lead developer did not return her smile. He kept his arms firmly crossed, staring at the conflicting documents scattered across the polished mahogany. He recognized the distinct odor of a collapsing deal. The documents spoke much louder than Beatrice and her desperate charm. Ms. Vance picked up her heavy fountain pen. She brought the metal base down against the wood table. The sharp, solitary tap echoed like a gavel strike, cutting straight through the web of lies my stepmother was trying to weave. "Mrs. Montgomery," Ms. Vance said. Her tone carried the frigid, detached authority of a professional who had just uncovered a severe liability. "Let me explain the mechanics of real estate law to you. A medical or financial power of attorney does not grant an agent the legal right to sell, liquidate, or encumber assets held within an irrevocable or revocable trust. The property belongs to the entity, not the individual. Your document is useless here." Beatrice opened her mouth to argue, but Ms. Vance raised a single hand, silencing her instantly. Furthermore, Ms. Vance continued, her eyes narrowing behind her wire-rimmed glasses. "My preliminary title search indicated this property reverted to Vivian individually based on an affidavit of trust dissolution, filed at the county courthouse yesterday morning. I am now looking at a certified copy of the active trust and evidence of medical incapacity. That means the dissolution affidavit you submitted to clear the title was a fraudulent instrument. Submitting a forged legal document to a title agency constitutes perjury." The word perjury landed on the table like a live grenade. The color drained from Beatrice and her meticulously contoured face. Bryce took a physical step backward, putting distance between himself and the forged paperwork, as if the paper itself might burn him. He had gambled his freedom on the assumption that nobody would verify the records before the cash wired. He had lost. The threat of criminal charges finally pierced the cowardly shell surrounding my father. Richard could no longer stare at the floor and pretend this was just a simple misunderstanding. He stood up from his leather chair, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. He stammered, stumbling over his words as he tried to construct a moral defense for their blatant theft. "Now wait a minute," Richard pleaded, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Nobody is trying to commit fraud here. My mother is severely ill. She requires around-the-clock medical supervision in a secure facility. The memory care unit is incredibly expensive. We are simply trying to liquidate an empty house to pay for Vivian and her ongoing medical care. We are doing this to protect her." I looked at my father. He was wearing the $12,000 chronograph watch purchased with anticipated stolen funds while attempting to hide behind the guise of a devoted son. The audacity of his lie demanded an immediate factual correction. I reached into the back of my manila folder. I retrieved the final stack of paper I had printed at the municipal library the day before. Kike. You are not selling the lake house to pay for memory care, I stated. My voice remained steady, cutting through his pathetic excuses. I slid the financial disclosures across the table, pushing them directly toward the two corporate developers. The pages fanned out, revealing the official court dockets and the bold red default notices. You are selling my grandmother and her legacy to pay off Bryce and his debts, I explained, looking directly at the cash buyers. My stepbrother defaulted on a $2.5 million commercial loan last week. He gambled on volatile crypto markets and failed commercial real estate ventures. The bank is preparing to seize all their assets. My stepmother is listed as the primary guarantor. They need your cash today because their personal bank accounts are going to be frozen by Monday morning. The lead developer picked up the printed court docket. His eyes scanned the multi-million-dollar default judgment and the guarantor signature line featuring Beatrice Montgomery. A look of utter disgust washed over his face. Men in his line of work dealt with distressed sellers every day, but they drew a hard line at participating in the financial exploitation of an elderly woman. They realized they were standing in a room with con artists who were perfectly willing to commit felony title fraud to cover their crypto gambling losses. The developer dropped the paper back onto the table as if it were contaminated. He turned his back on Bryce, ignoring the desperate pleading look my stepbrother offered. We are done here, the developer announced, adjusting the cuffs of his charcoal suit. We will not be party to a fraudulent conveyance. Expect to hear from our legal counsel regarding the recovery of our escrow fees and our wasted time. He gestured to his partner, and the two men walked toward the frosted glass door, eager to escape the radioactive blast radius of the Montgomery family. Ms. Vance gathered her expensive fountain pen and her unblemished closing packets. She maintained her cold professional composure, but the disdain in her posture was evident. She had a strict legal obligation to protect the integrity of the real estate market. I am halting this transaction immediately, Ms. Vance declared, her voice echoing with finality. I am also required by state law to flag this property file. Any future attempts to transfer this deed will require a judicial review. You need to leave my office before I contact the authorities. She reached to close the main property folder, finalizing the cancellation. Bryce let out a shaky breath, believing he had narrowly escaped a prison sentence by simply losing the deal. Beatrice gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning white as she processed the reality of her impending bankruptcy. They thought the worst thing that could happen today was walking away empty-handed. They thought the conflict was over. I stepped forward, placing my hand flat against the polished wood. Wait, I said. Ms. Vance paused, looking up at me with a questioning expression. The developer stopped near the heavy walnut door, turning back to see what could possibly remain. Richard sank back into his chair, his newly purchased watch clinking softly against the armrest. You need to read the final page of the trust, I told the escrow officer. The room went entirely quiet. It was the specific type of heavy, absolute vacuum that follows a massive structural collapse. The two corporate developers paused near the frosted glass exit, their hands hovering just above the brushed steel door handle. Richard remained frozen inside his expensive leather chair, staring blankly at the polished mahogany surface. Bryce stood rigidly near the catered breakfast credenza, breathing in shallow, jagged gasps as he tried to process his immediate financial ruin. Beatrice looked incredibly pale. Her carefully contoured face had lost all its vibrant color, leaving behind a chalky gray mask of defeat. She recognized that her fraudulent scheme had failed, and the Friday cash payday was officially canceled. However, she still did not comprehend the total magnitude of the damage she had just inflicted upon herself. She falsely believed the worst consequence was simply walking away empty-handed today, and perhaps hiring a defense attorney tomorrow. She thought the lake house remained a static asset they could eventually fight over in probate court once the dust settled. She possessed absolutely no idea that my grandmother had rigged the entire board with a hidden explosive. Ms. Vance looked at me from the head of the table. The escrow officer possessed decades of experience dealing with contested deeds and angry relatives, but my calm instruction clearly caught her off guard. She did not argue or dismiss my request. She recognized that I held the authentic documentation and therefore commanded the narrative. She reached across her desk blotter and picked up the certified trust instrument I had provided. Her manicured fingers flipped past the standard boilerplate distribution clauses and the successor trustee designations. She turned the heavy cotton paper until she reached page 42, the final sheet located right before the notarized signatures and the embossed county seal. I watched the veteran title agent lower her eyes to the text. The heading printed at the top of the page identified the section as a springing conservation clause. Beatrice crossed her arms over her designer silk blouse, attempting to project a lingering sense of socialite authority, but her trembling hands betrayed her deep internal panic. My stepmother grew up in a modest, working-class neighborhood, constantly aspiring to join the upper echelon of wealthy society. She spent her entire adult life acquiring expensive items to mask her deep-seated insecurities. She viewed the $3.6 million property strictly as a stepping stone to elevate her status among the local country club elite. She never understood that Vivian viewed the estate as a sacred family sanctuary. That fundamental difference in perspective was the exact reason Beatrice never bothered to thoroughly investigate the legal parameters of the trust. She assumed all wealthy people structured their money the exact same way. Ms. Vance began to read the dense statutory paragraphs out loud. Her voice started with a cool, detached professional cadence, translating the complex phrasing for the room. She read the provisions detailing the specific requirements for selling, transferring, or encumbering the Lake Butler property. She recited the lines explicitly naming me as the sole individual authorized to approve any real estate transaction. Then she reached the activation parameters, the specific triggering event that would unleash the dormant legal mechanism. The title officer read the words describing an unauthorized attempt to execute a sale using a secondary power of attorney. As she spoke, the sentence out loud, her voice began to slow down. The professional detachment evaporated from her tone, replaced by genuine shock. Ms. Vance stopped speaking entirely mid-sentence. Her eyes widened behind her wire-rimmed glasses, scanning the remainder of the page in rapid disbelief. She read the consequence portion of the clause silently to herself. The color drained from her own cheeks as the brilliant severity of the trap became undeniably clear. Ms. Vance slowly lowered the document, resting it flat against the mahogany table. She took a deep, measured breath and looked directly at my stepmother. The atmosphere in the conference room shifted from tense anticipation to a sickening, dreadful gravity. "You need to sit down," Ms. Vance told Beatrice. The command did not carry any anger. It carried pity. It was the exact tone a surgeon uses right before delivering a terminal diagnosis to an unsuspecting patient. Beatrice blinked, her false eyelashes fluttering rapidly. She refused to take a seat, choosing instead to grip the back of an empty chair for physical support. Bryce stepped forward slightly, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He demanded to know what the document said. He ordered the escrow officer to finish reading the paragraph, complaining that they were wasting valuable time on meaningless legal jargon. "It is not meaningless," Ms. Vance explained, looking at Bryce with a mixture of professional disgust and profound astonishment. "It is an irrevocable trigger. Your grandmother did not just build a defensive wall around her real estate. She weaponized the deed itself. Because you and your mother attempted to execute a cash sale today, utilizing a secondary medical directive without the explicit written authorization of the appointed successor trustee, you have activated a binding penalty clause." Richard finally lifted his head. His eyes darted nervously between the title officer and his wife. He asked what a penalty clause meant in this context. He wanted to know if they had to pay a fine or endure a waiting period before attempting another listing. His weak, cowardly mind was desperately searching for a comfortable exit strategy. "It means you no longer own the house," Ms. Vance stated plainly, stripping away the complex legalese so the devastating truth could land with maximum impact. "The moment you presented that fraudulent dissolution affidavit and attempted to force this transaction, you triggered the springing mechanism. The deed to the $3.6 million lake estate has instantly and permanently bypassed your family portfolio entirely. It is gone." Beatrice let out a sharp, breathless gasp, clutching her chest, as if she had been physically struck. She stammered, asking where the property went if it was no longer in the estate. "It now legally belongs to the Florida Environmental Land Trust," Ms. Vance answered, tapping the bottom paragraph of page 42. "It has been immediately converted into a protected conservation easement. It will eventually become a public nature preserve. The trust document clearly specifies that this transfer is absolute and cannot be reversed by any court or family member. Your grandmother donated the entire property to a nonprofit organization to ensure you could never profit from it." The profound, crushing silence returned to the room, dropping like a heavy steel anvil. I watched the complex mathematics compute inside Bryce and his desperate mind. He was 30 years old, drowning in a $2.5 million commercial loan default. He had staked his freedom, his business, and his entire future on liquidating this exact property today. He realized in real time that there was no asset left to leverage. There was no house to sell. Not today, not tomorrow, not next year. Even when Vivian eventually passed away, the real estate would remain permanently owned by the environmental group. The equity he planned to steal had evaporated into thin air, leaving him holding a massive bag of unpayable debt. He was financially ruined. But Vivian was incredibly thorough. I added speaking up to deliver the final component of the brilliant trap. I kept my voice perfectly level, refusing to offer them any emotional satisfaction. I turned toward my father, making sure he heard every single word. "The property belongs to the land trust now, but my grandmother retained a life estate provision. That means she holds the absolute legal right to live inside that house until she takes her final breath. Nobody can evict her. Nobody can bulldoze her azaleas. And nobody can force her into a state-run medical ward to save money. She is completely untouchable." Richard slumped backward into his expensive leather chair, looking utterly defeated. His $12,000 watch felt like a mocking heavy shackle anchoring him to the disaster he had enabled. He had traded his loyal mother for a financial payday that just went up in smoke. He possessed nothing now except a broken marriage and a disgraced reputation. Beatrice began to weep openly, sobbing into her manicured hands, as the reality of her impending bankruptcy crashed down upon her carefully curated socialite life. The two corporate developers standing near the exit had heard enough. They were businessmen who calculated risk and reward with cold precision. They realized Beatrice and Bryce had wasted their valuable time, lied about the chain of title, and dragged their corporate entity into a highly illegal mess. The lead developer turned toward his partner, his face locked in a scowl of pure, unadulterated anger. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and retrieved his mobile phone. "Call our legal counsel right now," the developer ordered, his voice cutting through the sounds of my stepmother crying. "Instruct our attorneys to draft a civil complaint immediately. We are going to sue these people for every single dollar we spent on escrow costs, inspection fees, and wasted corporate hours. I want their bank accounts frozen before noon." The developer yanked the heavy walnut door open and marched out of the frosted glass conference room, leaving the Montgomery family trapped inside their own self-made destruction. The hook was set. The legal avalanche had officially begun, and the impending fallout was going to bury them alive. The heavy walnut door clicked shut behind the departing developers, leaving an echoing void inside the frosted glass conference room. The atmosphere transformed instantly. The space no longer resembled a high-stakes corporate negotiation. It felt like a sterile holding cell waiting for the inmates to process their impending sentences. Ms. Vance did not issue a single verbal reprimand. The escrow officer simply stood up from her leather executive chair and began performing the quiet, methodical tasks of a mortician closing a casket. She reached across the polished mahogany table and gathered the crystal champagne flutes Beatrice had ordered for the occasion. She poured the untouched mimosas down a small stainless steel sink located near the catered breakfast credenza. She stacked the delicate porcelain plates containing imported French pastries and pushed them toward the trash bin. The celebration was officially a funeral, and Ms. Vance was clearing away the remaining evidence. Bryce watched the escrow officer dismantle his victory party. His chest heaved in rapid, erratic rhythms. The tailored navy suit that had projected such unearned confidence 10 minutes ago now looked like a cheap costume hanging off a terrified imposter. The realization of his permanent financial destruction sank into his bones. The commercial lenders in Miami were not going to offer him an extension. The corporate developers who just stormed out were going to file a devastating civil lawsuit before the courts closed for the weekend. The impending legal actions would freeze every single bank account tied to his holding company. He turned his gaze away from the empty champagne bottles and locked his eyes onto my father. "What are we going to do?" Bryce demanded. His voice cracked, losing its artificial swagger and exposing the desperate, frightened child hiding underneath the designer clothing. "Richard, you have to fix this. You told me the lake house would cover the margin call. You promised me the equity would clear the $2.5 million default before the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings." My father shrank backward, pressing his spine into the deep cushions of his chair. Richard spent his entire career in regional insurance sales, dodging accountability and passing difficult decisions onto his subordinates. He possessed a fundamental inability to face the consequences of his own actions. He looked at his stepson, observing the raw panic radiating from the younger man. Then Richard looked down at his own wrist. The brand-new $12,000 platinum chronograph felt like a heavy anchor dragging him straight toward the bottom of the ocean. He could not afford that watch. He could not afford his rented condo. He had staked his entire retirement on his mother and her stolen inheritance. Richard raised his head and pointed a trembling finger not at me, but directly at his wife. "Do not look at me." Richard snapped, his voice dripping with sudden toxic resentment. "You are the one who hired the sketchy notary Bryce, and your mother is the one who assured me the paperwork was flawless." He turned his body toward Beatrice, projecting decades of suppressed marital bitterness outward. "You said this was airtight," Richard yelled, dropping the quiet paternal facade he had maintained for years. "You sat in our kitchen and promised me you possessed the legal authority to handle my mother. You told me the medical directive superseded the old estate planning. You dragged us into a felony, Beatrice. If those developers sue us for fraud, I am going to lose my pension." The illusion of their perfect affluent marriage shattered into a million jagged pieces across the conference room table. They had built their relationship on the shallow foundation of mutual greed, and the moment the money vanished, their loyalty disintegrated. Beatrice recoiled from her husband as if he had slapped her across the cheek. She grabbed the edge of the mahogany table for physical support. Her meticulously sprayed blonde hair hung in loose, unkempt strands around her face. The designer makeup she used to project wealthy sophistication began to run, leaving dark, smudged trails of mascara down her pale cheeks. Beatrice was weeping. These were not the delicate, performative tears she deployed to garner sympathy at country club luncheons. These were ugly, panic-stricken sobs echoing with raw, primal terror. She understood that Richard was preparing to throw her under the bus to save his own skin. She realized Bryce was going to face criminal scrutiny for the forged dissolution affidavit. She saw the walls of her comfortable, luxurious life collapsing inward. Beatrice turned her tear-stained face toward me. She reached across the wide table, her manicured fingers grasping the empty air in a pathetic, begging gesture. "Alice, please," she pleaded. Her voice hitched, broken by the heavy sobs racking her chest. "You have to reverse this. You are the successor trustee. You can call the Environmental Land Trust and cancel the transfer. You can tell them it was a paperwork error. We are family, Alice. We can work this out privately. We can share the equity. Just undo the penalty clause before the bank takes everything we own." I stood at the opposite end of the table, maintaining my calm, steady posture. I looked down at the woman who had orchestrated the theft of a $3 million estate. I looked at the woman who had locked my grandmother inside a sterile medical facility, stripped away her personal belongings, and restricted her visitation rights. Beatrice invoked the word family only when she needed a shield to hide behind. She viewed kinship as a weapon of convenience. I did not raise my voice. I kept my tone measured and conversational, delivering the final blow with surgical precision. "I did not do this, Beatrice," I stated, holding her desperate gaze. "You did. I did not force you to hire a staging company behind my back. I did not force Bryce to file a forged document at the county courthouse. And I certainly did not force you to coerce a medical directive from a sedated 82-year-old woman." I gestured toward the certified documents resting on the polished wood. "My grandmother knew exactly who you were." I continued, the truth ringing loud and clear in the quiet room. "Vivian saw your greed coming from a mile away. She did not need me to defend her estate. She built a brilliant, irresistible trap, and she knew you lacked the patience to read the fine print. You walked yourself right into the snare because you thought you were the smartest person in the room. I cannot reverse the springing clause. The deed belongs to the conservation group now, and it will remain there forever." Beatrice let out a low, agonizing wail. She collapsed into one of the leather chairs, burying her ruined face in her hands. Richard stared at the frosted glass wall, unable to make eye contact with me. Bryce paced near the window, running his hands through his hair, repeating a quiet string of terrified curses. The implosion was total and complete. They had destroyed themselves, utilizing their own arrogance as the primary explosive. I reached across the blotter and gathered my original documents. I slid the trust deed, the physician capacity evaluation, and the hospital discharge records back into my manila folder. I sealed the flap, securing the protective armor that had saved Vivian and her legacy. I slung my leather purse over my shoulder and turned toward the brushed steel door handle. I had accomplished the first phase of the mission. The real estate was safe. Now I needed to secure the hostage. Before I pushed the heavy walnut door open, I reached into the side pocket of my tote bag. I pulled out one final piece of folded, crisp white paper. I walked back toward the table and dropped the single sheet right in front of my weeping stepmother. Beatrice flinched at the sound of the paper hitting the wood. She lowered her hands and stared at the document through her smeared mascara. "What is this?" Richard asked, his voice trembling with fresh dread. "That is a formal administrative notice," I replied, keeping my hand resting on the brass door handle. "I filed a detailed report yesterday morning providing a timeline of the coerced signatures and the suspicious medical isolation. Adult Protective Services has officially opened an investigation into the financial and physical exploitation of Vivian Montgomery. They are dispatching an investigator to audit your actions." I opened the conference room door, letting the cold, synthetic air of the hallway rush inside. "You should probably hire a defense attorney," I suggested. I stepped out of the glass-walled room, leaving the three of them to suffocate in the wreckage of their own making. I walked toward the elevator bank, my footsteps clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. The property dispute was finished. I just needed to retrieve the most valuable person in my life and bring her back to the sanctuary she had so cleverly protected. I did not linger in the downtown parking garage to watch my father and stepmother stumble out of the high-rise building. The real estate transaction was shattered beyond repair. The balance of power had shifted entirely, and I needed to capitalize on the momentum before the opposition could regroup. I paid my parking ticket and steered my aging Honda straight toward the highway. I drove away from the corporate skyline, heading back to the sterile compound where they were holding Vivian. The psychological weight that had suffocated me for the past 3 days was gone. I no longer felt like a subordinate daughter hoping for scraps of information. I felt like the architect of their ruin. I navigated the heavy Orlando traffic with a clear, focused objective. I was going to retrieve the hostage. The Grand Monarch Pavilion looked exactly the same as it had on Tuesday afternoon. The manicured palm trees swayed gently against the humid breeze. The automated security gate granted me entry with a quiet, mechanical hum. I parked near the front entrance and walked through the sliding glass doors. The lobby still smelled of piped-in lavender, designed to mask the clinical reality of the building. The receptionist sat behind her marble desk wearing her wireless headset. She recognized me from my previous visit and immediately reached for her desk phone. She remembered the strict instructions Beatrice had issued regarding my presence. I did not give the receptionist the opportunity to summon security. I bypassed her desk entirely and marched straight down the carpeted hallway toward the executive offices. I found a heavy oak door bearing a brass plaque labeled Facility Administrator. I opened the door without knocking. A woman in a tailored navy suit sat behind a large mahogany desk, reviewing a stack of patient files. She looked up, her expression morphing from mild irritation to stern disapproval. She stood up, smoothing the front of her jacket. "You are not authorized to be in this administrative wing," the woman stated, pointing toward the hallway. "Mrs. Montgomery made it exceptionally clear that you are restricted from the premises. I will call local law enforcement if you do not exit the building right now." I walked directly to her desk and opened my manila folder. I did not waste time arguing about family dynamics. I operated on the exact same frequency that had just dismantled the title closing. I relied on undeniable documentation. I pulled out 3 distinct pieces of paper and laid them flat across her pristine desk blotter. The first document is a certified copy of the Vivian Montgomery Revocable Living Trust, I explained, keeping my voice level and authoritative. It names me as the sole successor trustee, granting me absolute control over her physical estate and financial assets. The second document is my activated healthcare surrogate form. It predates the coerced medical directive my stepmother handed you by 11 months. My designation supersedes her fraudulent paperwork in every legal jurisdiction in this state. The administrator looked down at the official signatures and the embossed notary stamps. The righteous indignation began to drain from her face, replaced by the cautious hesitation of a healthcare bureaucrat recognizing a severe compliance issue. I tapped the third piece of paper. It was the formal administrative notice I had drafted the night before. This final document is an active case number filed with Adult Protective Services. I continued, holding her gaze. My stepmother isolated an 82-year-old woman in this facility against her will to facilitate a felony real estate transaction. The cash closing was just canceled by the title company due to verified title fraud. An investigator is currently reviewing every individual and organization that assisted Beatrice in this exploitation. If you prevent me from accessing my grandmother, you will be listed as a co-conspirator in a federal elder abuse investigation. The word liability works like magic inside the walls of private medical facilities. The administrator stared at the bold red APS case number printed across the top of the page. She realized instantly that Beatrice had dragged her luxury rehabilitation center into a massive legal disaster. The facility prided itself on catering to wealthy families looking for discreet, quiet transitions. They avoided state audits and criminal investigations at all costs. The administrator sat back down in her leather chair. The fight evaporated from her posture. "I will inform the charge nurse that you are processing a discharge," she murmured, sliding the documents back across the desk. "We will not interfere." I left her office and navigated the long, sterile corridors, heading toward the east wing. I reached room 214 and pushed the heavy wooden door open. The flat-screen television remained muted on the wall, playing a daytime cooking program. The institutional curtains were pulled back, allowing the bright afternoon sun to spill across the linoleum floor. Vivian sat in her vinyl medical recliner positioned near the sealed window. She was not staring blankly at the parking deck today. She held a folded newspaper in her lap, working diligently on the daily crossword puzzle. She held a blue ballpoint pen in her frail hand, pressing the ink firmly into the paper. She always used a pen for crosswords because she said pencils were for people who lacked conviction. I stepped into the room, holding the manila folder against my chest. Vivian looked up from her puzzle. The sharp creek water clarity remained present in her eyes. I walked over and knelt beside her chair. I placed my hand over hers, feeling the thin, papery skin and the dark purple bruising near her knuckles. "We kept the azaleas, Grandma," I told her. A profound, quiet joy filled the sterile room. Vivian did not need to ask about Beatrice or Bryce. She did not need to know the specific details of the title office confrontation. She knew her estate planning had functioned exactly as designed. She placed her blue pen on the windowsill and offered a small, satisfied smile. "I knew they would never read the fine print," she whispered. The emotional reunion was brief, because the practical reality of our departure required immediate attention. Bureaucratic friction is a persistent obstacle in corporate medicine. A charge nurse entered the room 10 minutes later carrying an electronic tablet. She attempted to stall the discharge process, insisting she needed verbal confirmation from Beatrice before she could remove the intravenous port from Vivian and her arm. I did not indulge the delay. I handed the nurse the certified healthcare surrogate form and reminded her that the facility administrator had already cleared the release. The nurse reviewed the legal phrasing, scanned the official notary seal, and nodded reluctantly. The satisfying reality of modern law is that when your paperwork is airtight, the bullies possess zero recourse. The nurse deactivated the monitors and carefully removed the medical tubing from my grandmother. I moved to the small closet and gathered the meager belongings Beatrice had packed. It took less than 3 minutes to fold the few cotton gowns and a single pair of slippers into a canvas duffel bag. While I gathered her personal items, my cell phone began to vibrate violently inside my blazer pocket. I pulled the device out and looked at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed my stepmother and her name. It was the 16th time she had attempted to contact me since I walked out of the frosted glass conference room. Beatrice was likely standing on the sidewalk outside the title agency, realizing her credit cards were about to decline, and her social empire was turning to ash. She wanted to negotiate. She wanted to plead. She wanted to manipulate the narrative one last time. I tapped the screen, navigating to her contact profile. I selected the block caller option. The phone went dark, silencing her frantic demands forever. I performed the same action for Bryce and Richard. Some boundaries require a quiet, permanent enforcement. I slid the phone back into my pocket, feeling a deep sense of finality. I arranged for a private, non-emergency medical transport van to carry Vivian back to the lake house. The facility staff provided a wheelchair to navigate the long, carpeted hallways. We moved through the lobby in silence, bypassing the marble reception desk. The sliding glass doors parted, allowing the heavy, humid Florida air to wash over us. The transition from captivity to freedom felt incredibly swift. The private transport van arrived 20 minutes later. The driver carefully assisted Vivian into the spacious cabin, securing her wheelchair for the long highway journey. I climbed into my aging Honda and pulled out of the parking lot, following the white van as it merged onto the northbound interstate. The drive back to Lake Butler took almost 2 hours. The afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting a golden hue across the dense pine forests lining the asphalt. I kept my eyes fixed on the rear bumper of the medical transport, feeling a steady rhythm of relief pulse through my veins. The legal war was over. We had successfully defended the territory. We turned off the main highway and navigated the winding dirt road leading toward the private estate. The familiar canopy of Spanish moss draped over the pavement, filtering the fading sunlight. We approached the wrought iron gates. The silver realtor lockbox was already missing from the black bars. I parked my car behind the transport van and stepped out onto the crushed gravel driveway. The environment felt entirely different than it had on Tuesday afternoon. The loud grinding roar of heavy diesel machinery no longer poisoned the quiet lake air. Instead, I heard the metallic clatter of heavy steel ramps hitting the ground. I walked around the side of the property and looked toward the back lawn. The 2 yellow bulldozers were no longer idling near the delicate flower beds. The contractors wearing their neon safety vests were actively driving the massive machines up onto long flatbed trailers. They were packing up their equipment, securing thick metal chains around the treads. The corporate developers had clearly issued the termination order the moment they left the title office. The excavation crew was abandoning the site, leaving the pristine grass and the vibrant pink azaleas entirely untouched. The house was safe. The legacy remained intact, shielded forever by the brilliant foresight of an 82-year-old woman. I stood on the driveway watching the heavy trucks rumble away down the dirt road. The dust settled over the quiet property, returning the estate to its natural, peaceful state. But as I watched the contractors disappear into the tree line, I knew the tranquility I felt here was not shared by everyone. For Vivian and me, the battle had concluded. For my father, my stepbrother, and the woman who tried to steal our history, the nightmare was just beginning to unfold. The passage of time often reveals the true structural integrity of a person. Over the next 90 days, the consequences of that Friday morning title meeting unfolded with the slow, undeniable precision of a falling domino sequence. I did not need to file any additional paperwork or initiate any lawsuits of my own. I simply watched from a distance as the trap they built for my grandmother snapped shut around their own ankles. The justice that followed was not dramatic or theatrical. It was a cold, logical accounting of their own greed. Bryce was the first casualty. Commercial lending operates on rigid, unforgiving mathematics. When his balloon payment came due 48 hours after the canceled closing, there was no miraculous cash injection to save his holding company. The Miami bank executed their default clauses with ruthless efficiency. I monitored the public court dockets from my records annex desk. By the second week of November, the lender filed a formal foreclosure notice seizing the half-finished Osceola County strip mall and freezing every corporate account tied to his name. Bryce could not afford to retain a defense attorney. His vanity real estate venture filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy liquidation. The image of the self-made mogul dissolved overnight. The leased German sports car he drove to intimidate local contractors was repossessed from his driveway. His custom-tailored suits were useless when he no longer had a boardroom to command. Stripped of his fake wealth and drowning in personal debt, Bryce packed whatever fit into a rented moving truck and fled the state of Florida. He relocated to a sprawling suburb outside Atlanta, taking a mid-level regional sales job at a logistics firm. He was no longer a chief executive officer. He was just another desperate employee working for a base salary, making a fraction of the income he once pretended to possess. But his financial ruin was merely the opening act. Beatrice and Richard were legally chained to his sinking ship through that initial loan guarantor signature. When the commercial bank liquidated Bryce and found the assets insufficient to cover the $2.5 million deficit, they immediately turned their crosshairs onto my father and stepmother. Simultaneously, the two corporate developers from the title office made good on their threat. They filed a devastating civil lawsuit in the county court, naming Beatrice and Richard as co-defendants in a fraudulent misrepresentation case. The developers sought exorbitant damages for their wasted escrow fees, inspection costs, and lost corporate hours. The legal retainers required to fight a multi-front war against a corporate bank, and an angry development firm drained my father and his remaining savings within a single month. The financial bleeding was compounded by the arrival of the state authorities. Adult Protective Services does not ignore formal complaints involving coerced medical directives and million-dollar real estate transfers. A state investigator visited the Grand Monarch Pavilion. She pulled the visitor logs, reviewed the facility's security protocols, and interviewed the charge nurses. More importantly, she subpoenaed the hospital records, detailing the heavy narcotic painkillers prescribed to Vivian during the exact window Beatrice secured that forged signature. The agency substantiated the claim of financial exploitation. While the state declined to press immediate criminal charges due to the swift reversal of the sale, the official finding became a permanent part of the public record. In affluent suburban communities, a ruined reputation is far more lethal than an empty bank account. Richard spent his entire adulthood cultivating a pristine image among the local country club elite. He relied on those wealthy connections to sustain his insurance brokerage firm. Beatrice lived for the validation of her charity gala committees and her exclusive tennis leagues. They believed their social status elevated them above the rules governing ordinary people. But secrets leak. The details of the canceled title closing and the Adult Protective Services investigation quietly circulated through the manicured golf courses and the velvet-lined dining rooms. High society executes its judgment without raising its voice. There were no public confrontations or shouting matches in the club lobby. The ostracization was polite, silent, and total. Beatrice noticed the shift when her phone stopped ringing. The charity board she chaired for 3 years held an emergency restructuring meeting and suggested she step down to focus on her family matters. The tennis ladies suddenly found their schedules too full to accommodate a morning match. Richard watched his premier insurance clients gradually transfer their lucrative portfolios to competing brokers. Nobody wanted to trust their financial future to a man caught attempting to defraud his own elderly mother. They became ghosts, haunting a social circle that no longer acknowledged their existence. The crushing weight of the civil lawsuits eventually broke their affluent facade entirely. Facing total insolvency, Richard was forced to liquidate his remaining personal assets just to keep their defense counsel on retainer. The starkest symbol of their downfall occurred in late November. My father walked into a high-end jewelry broker in downtown Orlando and unclasped the pristine platinum chronograph from his wrist. He sold the $12,000 watch he had purchased with anticipated stolen funds. He traded the ultimate symbol of his greed for a fraction of its retail value just to pay for another month of legal survival. It was not enough to save their primary residence. By early December, Richard and Beatrice sold their sprawling 4-bedroom colonial house, utilizing the meager equity to settle the developer's lawsuit out of court. They packed their remaining possessions and downsized to a cramped rented condo located in a highly congested zip code near the interstate. Their new reality consisted of noisy traffic-thin walls and the lingering toxic resentment of a marriage destroyed by a failed scam. The contrast between their chaotic ruin and my quiet existence felt profound. I had taken a formal leave of absence from the county probate archives. I moved my belongings into the guest suite of the Lake Butler estate, transitioning into the role of full-time caregiver for Vivian. We spent our autumn mornings drinking tea on the veranda, watching the blue herons wade through the shallow water. The air was crisp, and the environment was saturated with a deep, unshakable peace. The springing conservation clause sat securely in the county vault, guaranteeing that no developer or greedy relative would ever touch the soil beneath our feet. Thanksgiving arrived, bringing a cool, gentle breeze off the lake. I spent the afternoon roasting a small turkey and baking a fresh lemon pound cake. Vivian sat at the kitchen island peeling potatoes and humming a song from her childhood. The house felt warm, smelling of sage and melted butter. I walked into the living room to retrieve a serving platter and felt my cell phone vibrate in my pocket. I pulled the device out and glanced at the illuminated screen. The spam filter had intercepted an email from an address I had blocked weeks ago. I opened the filtered folder out of mild curiosity. The sender was Richard. The subject line was empty. I tapped the message, opening the short text string. It consisted of 2 pathetic sentences typed from a man sitting in a rented condo, listening to highway traffic instead of his family. I miss you both. I am sorry. I stared at the glowing pixels. A younger version of myself might have felt a twinge of guilt or a desperate urge to respond. A younger Alice might have believed the apology was genuine, hoping to salvage a relationship that had always been fundamentally broken. But working in the archives teaches you that some historical records cannot be rewritten. Richard was not apologizing for the betrayal. He was apologizing because the betrayal failed. He missed the comfort of the lake house, and he missed the quiet, compliant daughter who never challenged his authority. He wanted to bridge the gap now that his wife was socially exiled, and his stepson was banished to a mediocre corporate cubicle. He wanted a lifeline. I did not type a response. I did not demand further accountability or hurl righteous insults through the digital ether. Some boundaries once crossed are permanent. When people show you they are willing to trade your dignity for a luxury watch, you do not invite them back to your dinner table. I pressed the small trash can icon located at the bottom of the screen. The message vanished, permanently deleted from the server. I placed the phone down on a side table and walked back into the bright, warm kitchen. The conflict was fully resolved. The antagonists had systematically destroyed themselves, leaving the protagonist completely untouched by the shrapnel of their ruin. I picked up the serving platter and smiled at my grandmother, ready to set the table for a quiet celebration. The calendar eventually turned, bringing us to a quiet Tuesday afternoon in late April. The central Florida humidity had not yet reached its suffocating summer peak. A gentle breeze rolled off the surface of Lake Butler, carrying the crisp scent of fresh pine needles and clear fresh water. I stepped out onto the back veranda and leaned against the wooden railing. This was the exact spot where I spent my childhood summers, learning how to read chapter books and watching the afternoon thunderstorms roll across the horizon. The landscape felt entirely secure now, holding a deep, unshakable peace that permeated every single wooden plank and brick on the property. I looked down at the edge of the manicured lawn. The azaleas were in full magnificent bloom. They formed a vibrant, impenetrable wall of bright pink and pristine white petals, standing as a living testament to resilience. Just a few months ago, a heavy diesel bulldozer sat idling inches away from those delicate branches, ready to tear them from the soil, to make room for a luxury infinity pool. Now the flowers thrived, stretching their leaves toward the afternoon sun, completely unbothered by the greed that had briefly threatened their existence. The garden remained exactly as my grandfather had designed it decades ago. The legal architecture shielding this sanctuary was officially complete. A few weeks prior, I received a thick manila envelope from the county clerk office. It contained the finalized stamped documents recording the irrevocable conservation easement. The title to the $3.6 million estate was formally transferred to the Florida Environmental Land Trust. A representative from the nonprofit organization had even visited the grounds, walking the property lines with a clipboard and a wide, appreciative smile. He cataloged the old-growth cypress trees and the nesting sites of the local blue herons, recording the natural assets that would now remain permanently untouched. The representative assured us that upon Vivian passing, the entire parcel would be converted into a protected public nature preserve. The land would never see a commercial developer. No contractor would ever pour a concrete foundation here. No staging company would ever carry synthetic vanilla air fresheners through these halls. The dirt was safe. But more importantly, the life estate provision functioned flawlessly. The property belonged to the trust on paper, but the home belonged entirely to my grandmother for the remainder of her natural life. She possessed the absolute legal right to exist inside her sanctuary without the looming threat of eviction or forced medical isolation. Securing her future required me to make a significant change to my own routine. I submitted a formal request for an indefinite leave of absence from my position at the county probate archives. My supervisor approved the request immediately, understanding the gravity of the situation. I drove back up to Tallahassee, packed my small apartment into cardboard boxes, and moved my life down to the lake house. I reclaimed my old space inside the guest cottage, unpacking my books and tuning my acoustic guitar. I transitioned from deciphering the complicated legacies of strangers to actively protecting the legacy of the woman who raised me. Becoming a full-time caregiver was not the career trajectory I originally mapped out for my 30s. My days were no longer measured by indexing court files or digging through municipal ledgers in a windowless room. Instead, my schedule revolved around medication management, grocery runs, and quiet mornings reading the newspaper on the porch. Some of my old colleagues questioned the decision, suggesting I was putting my professional advancement on hold. They did not understand the profound clarity that accompanies this kind of work. Protecting a vulnerable loved one from exploitation offers a unique type of fulfillment that a corporate paycheck can never replicate. I turned away from the railing and walked back inside the house, entering the sunlit kitchen. The pristine quartz island no longer held glossy real estate brochures or lockbox combinations. It held a simple glass cake stand. Inside the dome sat a freshly baked lemon pound cake. It was the exact same recipe I had brought to the empty house back in October on her 82nd birthday. That first cake had ended up abandoned and stale, a casualty of my stepmother and her orchestrated kidnapping. Today, the baking process felt like a quiet celebration of our victory. I opened the wooden cabinets and bypassed the everyday ceramic plates. I reached for the top shelf and pulled down 2 pieces of the good china. The plates featured a delicate floral pattern trimmed in faded gold leaf. Beatrice had despised this china, calling it outdated and insisting on serving her catered events on modern square porcelain. I loved the heavy, familiar weight of these plates. They carried decades of Thanksgiving dinners, holiday mornings, and quiet family milestones. I sliced 2 thick pieces of the lemon pound cake, placing them carefully onto the fine china. I carried the plates and a pair of silver forks back out to the veranda. Vivian sat in her favorite wicker rocking chair, positioned perfectly to catch the afternoon breeze. She wore a soft lavender cardigan over a pressed linen blouse. Her silver hair was neatly styled, returning to its familiar, elegant shape. The dark purple bruises that once covered her fragile hands had faded away entirely, leaving behind clear, healthy skin. She looked rested. The heavy, medicated fog that hung over her inside that Orlando facility was completely gone, replaced by her natural, sharp awareness. She held a folded daily newspaper in her lap, working diligently on the crossword puzzle. A blue ballpoint pen rested lightly between her fingers. She looked up as I approached, hearing the soft clink of the silver forks against the china. Her eyes brightened, taking in the sight of the dessert. I handed her a plate and sat down in the adjacent wicker chair, resting my own plate on my lap. We sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, listening to the gentle lapping of the lake water against the wooden shoreline dock. Vivian picked up her fork and carved a small bite from the corner of the pound cake. She brought it to her lips and chewed slowly, savoring the bright citrus flavor and the sweet buttery crumb. She lowered her fork and looked out across the expansive blue water. A pair of white egrets glided low over the surface, their wings tracing a silent, elegant path toward the distant cypress trees. The afternoon light cast a warm, golden glow across her face, highlighting the deep laugh lines around her eyes. She let out a soft, quiet chuckle. The sound was rich and genuine, rising from a place of deep, unshakable security. She turned her head and looked directly at me. Her creek-water eyes sparkled with a profound, knowing amusement. "They really didn't read the fine print, did they?" she asked, her voice carrying a light, musical lilt. I smiled, feeling a deep well of affection rise inside my chest. I thought about Beatrice sobbing in the title office and Bryce fleeing the state to escape his commercial lenders. I thought about the sheer arrogance required to underestimate the quiet woman sitting next to me. "They never do, Grandma," I replied. We finished our dessert on the veranda, allowing the serene atmosphere to wash over us. The long, bitter conflict had finally reached its natural conclusion. The people who treated family members like disposable financial assets were currently suffering the exact consequences of their own unreadable greed. They were living in cramped, rented spaces, drowning in legal fees and hiding from a society that rightfully rejected them. Meanwhile, the woman they tried to discard sat comfortably on her own porch, eating cake on fine china, completely untouched by the shrapnel of their ruin. The entire ordeal served as a brutal masterclass in the true nature of boundaries. A person and their inherent dignity does not suddenly expire just because their memory occasionally falters or their physical strength wanes. Value is not tied to productivity or bank accounts. The people who mistake silence for weakness often learn the hardest lessons. The loudest individuals in the room rely on intimidation and theatrical displays because their foundation is inherently rotten. But the quietest people, the ones who methodically prepare and patiently wait, often hold the absolute strongest boundaries. When you combine unshakable resolve with flawless paperwork, the bullies simply have nowhere left to run. They build their own traps, and you only need to hand them the shovel. The law, when properly applied, functions as an impenetrable shield for those who cannot raise their own fists. My grandmother understood this fundamental truth better than any attorney I ever met. She recognized the incoming threat and she neutralized it without ever raising her voice. That's my story. One empty open house, one manila folder, and a grandmother who weaponized a deed. If this reminded you to protect the people you love, drop a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. We live in a culture that often measures a person's worth by their speed, their volume, and the balance of their bank account. In America, there is a dangerous tendency to look at the elderly and see only expiration dates. We see fading memories and frail hands, and too often society mistakenly equates a quiet demeanor with a loss of agency. But if my grandmother Vivian taught me anything, it is that true power doesn't need to shout, and dignity never simply expires. When I look back at the wreckage left behind by my stepmother Beatrice and my stepbrother Bryce, I realize their downfall wasn't just a matter of legal maneuvering. It was a failure of character born from a uniquely modern kind of greed. They were blinded by the hustle, the designer clothes, the country club status, the desperate need to leverage a quick $3.6 million cash sale to cover their own reckless mistakes. They walked into that Orlando title office wearing their arrogance like armor, fully believing that whoever spoke the loudest and moved the fastest would automatically win. They forgot that the most impenetrable fortresses are often built in absolute silence. Vivian didn't fight them with tears or dramatic family confrontations. She didn't have to. In a world rushing toward the next payday, she sat in her wicker chair on the back veranda, picked up a red pen, and carefully structured a legal trap that weaponized their own greed against them. That simple manila folder held more than just a revocable trust and a springing conservation clause. It held a profound lesson about the nature of boundaries. A strong boundary doesn't always require a raised voice. Sometimes it just requires a notary stamp, a bit of foresight, and the patience to let arrogant people dig their own graves by refusing to read the fine print. The legacy of the lake house wasn't about the money. It was about preserving a sanctuary where azaleas bloom and quiet moments are deeply respected. It was a reminder that you cannot assign a liquidation value to a lifetime of memories, and you certainly cannot strip an older person of their autonomy just because they've stopped keeping up with the relentless, exhausting pace of the modern world. Stories like Vivian's happen every single day, hidden behind the closed doors of sterile wellness facilities and glass-walled corporate offices. If this quiet victory struck a chord with you, if it reminded you of the fierce, unspoken strength of the older generation, I encourage you to hit subscribe and follow the Elderly Stories channel. We are building a community that honors the wisdom, the resilience, and the undeniable dignity of those who came before us. As the dust finally settles over Lake Butler and the yellow bulldozers fade into a distant memory, I sometimes find myself standing on the porch, listening to the wind move through the Spanish moss. I think about my father sitting in his cramped, rented condo, staring at the walls of a prison he built himself. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? As we rush through our own lives, desperate to acquire and achieve, what fine print are we failing to read? When the time comes to measure our own worth, will we be the ones holding the pen? Or will we be the ones left staring at an empty room, realizing too late that the most valuable things we possessed were never truly ours to sell?